Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I've always believed in the supernatural, in the things that go bump in the night, but I never thought I would find myself tangled in something so horrifying. Something so dark that it would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew. My name is Lucas, and this is the story of how I unknowingly walked into the lair of a sinister cult that had been hiding in the shadows for centuries. It all started when I decided to take a road trip up north. I needed a break, time away from the city and my chaotic life. I heard about a place called Pinebrook, a small town nestled in the mountains. It was known for its dense forests, quiet trails, and peaceful atmosphere. The idea of spending a few days surrounded by nature sounded perfect to me, so I packed my bags and headed off without giving it much thought. The drive was long, but beautiful. The further I went, the more isolated the road became. Soon, the highway was surrounded by thick trees on both sides, casting deep shadows that seemed to swallow up the light. By the time I reached Pinebrook, the sun had already set, leaving the town bathed in a dull twilight. Pinebrook was just as quiet as I had imagined, almost too quiet. There were only a handful of houses, a small grocery store, and an old, weathered inn. I checked into the inn, greeted by an elderly woman who seemed to know little about modern life. She barely looked up from her knitting as she handed me the key to my room. "Stay off the main trail after dark," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The woods are not safe at night." I nodded, thinking it was just another local superstition. The small town was peaceful, after all. What could possibly go wrong? That evening, I decided to take a walk through the town. Pinebrook was tucked away, almost forgotten by the outside world, and I was enjoying the serenity. As I walked along the cobblestone path, I couldn't help but notice that the people I passed on the street gave me curious glances. They didn't stare exactly, but there was something unsettling about the way they watched me. Like I was an outsider in a place where outsiders weren't welcome. The air was cool, and the wind had a slight chill to it. The streets were almost empty, save for the occasional person moving quickly from one place to another. The town seemed to be alive, but not in the way I expected. It was as though everything was happening behind closed doors, in the shadows, hidden from view. As I wandered deeper into the town, I noticed an old church at the edge of the square. It looked abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows. But there was something about it that intrigued me. I had always been drawn to old buildings, especially ones that seemed forgotten by time. The door was ajar, and I could hear faint sounds coming from inside, soft chanting, like a distant hum. It was odd, but I couldn't resist the urge to peek inside. I pushed the door open, and as soon as I stepped inside, the air grew colder. The church was dimly lit, with candles flickering along the walls. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the scent of incense filled the air. I couldn't see anyone at first, but I could hear the chanting more clearly now, echoing through the empty space. I moved deeper into the church, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The chanting grew louder, and I finally saw them. Figures dressed in long, dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. They stood in a circle around an altar at the center of the room, their hands raised as if in some kind of trance. The words they chanted were in a language I didn't recognize, and the more I listened, the more unsettled I became. Something about the scene felt wrong. This wasn't just a prayer meeting. This was something far darker. I stepped backward, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The sound of chanting stopped immediately, and the room fell into a heavy silence. I turned, heart racing, only to find the robed figures staring at me. Their eyes gleamed from beneath their hoods, and I felt a chill wash over me. One of them took a step forward, their voice low and calm. "You shouldn't be here," they said, their words thick with an unnatural weight. Before I could respond, the door opened, and the elderly woman from the inn appeared. Her face was pale, her expression stern. "Leave them be," she said softly, almost pleading. "You're not meant to see this." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted out of the church, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't stop running until I was back at the inn. where I slammed the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the robed figures, those dark eyes glowing in the shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I tried to brush off what had happened. Maybe it was a ritual, I thought, some kind of strange local tradition. I convinced myself that I was overreacting. But when I went downstairs to have breakfast, the elderly woman was waiting for me, her hands trembling as she set a plate of food on the table. "You need to leave," she said, her voice shaky. "It's already begun." I didn't understand what she meant, but the urgency in her tone sent a cold shiver down my spine. I tried to ask her what she meant, but she simply shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "Do you know what they are?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They've been here for generations, watchers in the woods, the cult that controls Pinebrook." Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. A cult? That couldn't be possible. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was something deeply wrong with this town. They worship something ancient, she continued, her voice trembling, something that sleeps beneath the earth. And every year, they need a sacrifice. Someone like you. I froze. The blood drained from my face as her words sank in. The cult. They had been watching me all along. It wasn't a coincidence that I had stumbled into the church. It wasn't a random encounter. "You've been marked," she said, her voice shaking. "Once they know who you are, they will stop at nothing to take you." That evening, I tried to leave Pinebrook. I packed my things, rushed out of the inn, and drove as fast as I could down the winding mountain road. But as the sun began to set, I realized something. There was no way out. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and every turn I took only led me deeper into the woods. I could hear whispers on the wind, the soft chant that had haunted me since the night before. I looked into my rearview mirror, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, but all I could see were trees. The road ahead was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then I saw them, the figures in the road, dark, hooded shapes, standing still as statues. They were watching me. They were waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed on the brakes, but the car wouldn't stop. It felt as though the road itself was pulling me toward them. And just as I was about to collide with the figures, I woke up. I don't know how long I was out. All I know is that I woke up in the church, surrounded by the robed figures. They were chanting again, their eyes glowing in the dim light. I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, as though they were bound by invisible chains. I couldn't escape. They had taken me. The last thing I remember was the figure at the front of the circle. Its eyes locked onto mine. "You are ours now," it whispered. "Welcome to the sacrifice." I don't know how I made it out of Pinebrook. Some say I'm lucky to be alive. I don't remember how I escaped, but when I woke up in my car, I was miles away from the town, my hands shaking, my body covered in dirt and bruises. I never went back to Pinebrook, and I never will. But I know one thing. The cult is real. The watchers are out there, still waiting, still watching. And if you're ever in the woods late at night, you might feel their eyes on you too. If you do, don't run, because they'll catch you before you even know it. I had always heard rumors about Hollowbrook, a town that sat on the edge of a deep forest. It was a place that, according to the locals, no one ever came back from. People would visit, but they wouldn't stay for long, and they never spoke of what happened there. I had no idea that a simple visit would drag me into the terrifying world of a cult that had been operating in the shadows for decades. It was the summer after I graduated high school when I decided to take a road trip with a few of my friends. We wanted to see the world, or at least explore a place we'd never been before. One of the spots that caught my attention was Hollowbrook. It wasn't on any tourist map, but I had heard whispers of it. Somewhere far enough off the beaten path to feel untouched by the world, and maybe even dangerous. We arrived around dusk, and the town looked exactly how I had imagined it. Quiet, secluded. There was a strange heaviness in the air, though, that I couldn't explain. The houses were spaced out, far apart from each other, and a thick mist clung to the ground as if the town itself was part of the forest that surrounded it. The trees looked older than anything I'd ever seen before, gnarled and twisted, with roots that snaked above the earth like fingers. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I brushed it off as just being unfamiliar with the place. We stopped at a small, run-down diner that sat at the edge of the town square. There were only a few people inside, their faces drawn and tired. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a distant look in her eyes, took our orders without saying much. She didn't seem happy to see us, but that didn't deter me. We were there to enjoy the night, have some fun, and maybe take in the sights. "You folks not from around here, huh?" the waitress asked after setting down our plates. "Yeah," I replied, trying to make small talk. "Just passing through. We were thinking about checking out the forest tomorrow." She froze for a moment, and her eyes flickered nervously toward the window. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I wouldn't do that. There's something out there. Something that doesn't want visitors." My friends laughed, thinking she was just joking, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't. It felt like she was trying to warn us, but she didn't want to say more. As the evening wore on, we finished our meal and decided to head back to our rented cabin just outside of town. The forest was looming on the horizon, dark and ominous, and my curiosity only grew stronger. I wanted to know what it was about that place that made people so uneasy. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room felt stifling, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear a faint whispering in the distance, like someone calling my name. I told myself it was just the wind in the trees, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, my friends and I decided to explore the forest. We packed up some snacks and set off, not thinking twice about the warning the waitress had given us. The forest was beautiful at first, tall trees, vibrant green moss covering the ground, and sunlight filtering through the thick canopy. But the further we went, the quieter it got. There were no birds, no insects buzzing around. The silence was suffocating. As we ventured deeper, we began to notice strange things. Symbols carved into the trees, twisted, angular shapes that didn't seem to have any natural origin. I dismissed it as graffiti, but something about the way the symbols were arranged made my skin crawl. They weren't random. They were deliberate, purposeful. That's when I saw it. Off in the distance, partially hidden behind the thick underbrush, there was an old stone structure. It looked like a forgotten chapel, overgrown with vines and moss. We decided to check it out. The closer we got, the more unsettling the place became. The air around the chapel felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing against us. The stones that made up the walls were ancient, cracked, and weathered. There was no sign of any recent activity, no footprints or signs of life. It was as though the chapel had been abandoned for centuries, but something about it felt alive. We stepped inside, and the temperature dropped instantly. It was colder in here than it had been outside, and the air smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. There was a large altar in the center of the room, and what struck me the most were the strange carvings around it. More symbols, but these were different. They were more intricate, more detailed, and beneath the altar, partially obscured by dust and dirt, was something else, a wooden box. Curiosity took hold of me, and I opened the box. Inside, I found a book. It was old, its pages yellowed with age. The book felt heavy in my hands, as though it contained more than just words. It felt like it held a power, something that had been hidden away for centuries. Before I could even flip through the pages, a voice called out from behind me. "You shouldn't have touched that." I turned quickly to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a long black coat. His face was pale, and his eyes were dark, almost too dark. It was as if the shadows of the forest had taken root in his gaze. "What is this place?" I asked, trying to sound brave despite the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me. "This is the Hollow," the man replied. His voice was deep, smooth, almost hypnotic. "And you've just stumbled upon something that was never meant for your eyes." At that moment, everything clicked. The strange symbols, the eerie silence in the forest, the warnings from the locals. It all made sense. Hollowbrook wasn't just a town. It was a place of ritual, of ancient, twisted rites that had been carried out for generations. The man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've seen too much. You've been marked now." Before I could ask what he meant, he raised his hand, and the air in the chapel seemed to shift. It felt like the ground beneath me was vibrating, and I could hear whispers, soft and low, like voices calling from the corners of the room. I turned to run, but the doorway was blocked by a group of figures. More people in dark coats, their faces hidden by hoods. They moved closer, circling around me. "Join us," one of them said. "You're one of us now." I tried to push through them, but it was like I was moving through molasses. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the cold fingers of fear creeping up my spine. "You don't belong here," I shouted, trying to break free. But the more I struggled, the tighter the grip became. They began chanting, their voices merging together into one, low and undulating, like a wave crashing over me. The words were incomprehensible, but they didn't need to make sense. They were binding me, drawing me into their world. In that moment, I realized what had happened. The cult had been operating in the shadows for generations, carrying out their rituals to maintain their grip on Hollowbrook. They weren't just isolated, they were connected, their influence stretching far beyond the town's borders. I didn't know how long I was trapped there, but eventually, everything went silent. The whispers faded, and the cold lifted. I was back outside the chapel alone, with the book still in my hands. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the gnawing feeling that I had become a part of their ritual. I was marked. The book's pages seemed to whisper now, as if urging me to open it, to understand what it held. But I knew I couldn't. I had to leave before I became like them. I ran from the forest, not looking back. By the time I made it back to the town, it was dark. I didn't even stop at the diner. I just packed my bags and left, leaving the town behind me. But I could still feel the weight of the book in my hands. It's been years since that night, but I can't escape the memories of what I saw. Hollowbrook is still out there, still hidden in the shadows, and I know I'll never be able to forget the chilling faces I saw in the woods, the Watchers, as I now call them. I don't talk about what happened to anyone, but every once in a while, I hear rumors about people who go missing in the woods, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear the whispers again, calling me back to the Hollow. If you ever find yourself near the forest, beware. The eyes of the Hollow are always watching, and once they've seen you, you may never leave. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip with my closest friends, but it quickly turned into a nightmare that has haunted me ever since. My name is Sarah, and I still can't shake the terror of what happened that night. In the woods beyond the small town of Black Hollow, this is the story of how we stumbled into a sinister cult's ritual and how it changed our lives forever. It all began when we decided to get away for the weekend. We've been cooped up for months, stressed out from school and work, and needed a break from everything. One of my friends, Rachel, suggested camping in Black Hollow, a remote area that was known for its beautiful, untouched wilderness. It wasn't far from the city, and Rachel had been there a few times before, saying it was peaceful and serene. We packed our bags, grabbed some camping gear, and headed off, excited for a few days of hiking, campfires, and relaxation. I remember the drive out there. The further we went, the more isolated the landscape became. The trees grew thicker, the roads narrower, and soon we found ourselves surrounded by dense forest on all sides. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun had already started to dip below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over everything. "Perfect," Rachel said as she unpacked the car. No one around for miles. We set up our tents and made a fire, the flickering light casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. There was a sense of quiet, almost unnatural in its stillness. The air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to ignore the feeling, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the sound of my friends' laughter as we cooked marshmallows and shared stories. As night fell, we gathered around the fire and started telling ghost stories, the kind that always sounded better around a campfire. But then Rachel mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Has anyone heard about the Black Lantern?" she asked, her voice low and serious. I stopped mid-sentence, staring at her. "What's the Black Lantern?" Rachel smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "It's a local legend. They say that if you wander into the woods at night, you might see a lantern light in the distance. It's said to be the light of the cult. The cult? I asked, a little uneasy. She nodded, leaning closer to the fire. Yeah, the cult of the Black Lantern. They're believed to be ancient, a secret group that has been living in the woods for centuries. They follow some dark rituals, and they say that they offer sacrifices to whatever is in the forest in exchange for power. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I laughed it off, trying to convince myself it was just a spooky story. Rachel had a knack for making everything sound terrifying. We continued with our campfire stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we were being watched. Every now and then, I would glance at the trees at the edge of our campsite, but nothing was there, just the shadows swaying in the breeze. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then it came again, a faint, hollow ringing, like a bell in the distance. I rubbed my eyes and looked around, but all I could see was the dim light of the campfire dying out. The sound continued, and this time it was louder. It was almost as if it was calling to me, urging me to follow. I tried to ignore it, pulling my blanket tighter around me and shutting my eyes. But the ringing grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside the tent. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft, like a whisper, but clear as day. "Sarah, come outside." I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. It was Rachel's voice, but it sounded strange, like it wasn't really her. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying embers of our campfire. But in the distance, I saw it, a small, flickering light, bobbing just beyond the tree line. The lantern. Without thinking, my legs carried me toward it, drawn by an invisible force. I tried to call out to my friends, but my voice was stuck in my throat. It was as if I couldn't stop myself, couldn't control my movements. The lantern seemed to move, always staying just out of reach. I pushed through the trees, the branches scratching at my arms, the underbrush crunching beneath my feet. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder and more oppressive. And then I saw them, figures draped in long black robes, standing in a circle. Their faces were obscured by hoods, and their hands were raised in the air, as if summoning something from the darkness. At the center of the circle was an altar, a stone slab covered in strange symbols, and on it, a figure was bound, struggling against the ropes that held it in place. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I realized with a sickening lurch that the figure on the altar was Rachel. My heart dropped. I tried to run toward her, but something held me back, a force stronger than my own will, tugging me toward the circle of cultists. The lantern flickered again, and I saw their eyes, dark and empty, fixed on me. They weren't human eyes. They were something else, cold, lifeless, and full of hunger. One of the cultists stepped forward, raising a hand to silence the others. "She's here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The final one. I didn't understand what he meant, but I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. They were waiting for me. They had been waiting for me all along. Rachel's voice cut through the air, desperate. "Sarah, help me." But it was too late. The cultist raised a knife, and in one swift motion, he slashed it across her chest. Blood poured from the wound, splashing onto the altar, and the air around us seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the lantern's flame flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the forest. I could hear chanting, but not in any language I recognized. It sounded like the forest itself was speaking, calling to something ancient and terrible. I couldn't watch any longer. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, but I could still hear the chanting, still feel the darkness pressing in from all sides. I wanted to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to wake up. When I finally opened my eyes, I was back at the campsite, lying on the cold ground, my body covered in dirt and leaves. The fire had long since burned out, and my friends were nowhere to be seen. The forest was silent, but the sense of dread lingered, as if the darkness had followed me home. I stood up, shaking, and stumbled back toward the town. I don't remember much after that, just running through the woods, hearing footsteps behind me, and a voice calling my name. But I couldn't look back. I couldn't let them see me again. I don't know what happened to Rachel. I don't know what the cult was trying to summon, or why they wanted me, but I never returned to Black Hollow. I couldn't. Every night, I hear that same ringing sound in the distance, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the flickering light of the black lantern, calling to me from the darkness. And I know, deep down, that the cult isn't gone. They're still out there, waiting, and they'll never let me forget what I saw, what I became a part of. If you ever find yourself near Black Hollow, don't listen to the whispers. Don't follow the light, because once you see the black lantern, it's too late. They'll come for you, and they won't stop until they have you, too. My name is Luke, and this is the story of how my friends and I barely escaped the clutches of an ancient cult. It all started one late autumn afternoon when we decided to take a road trip to a remote village called Whispering Hollow, a place with a dark history we had no idea about. The horrors we encountered there would change my life forever. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend getaway. My friends and I, Jake, Mia, and Emma, were all exhausted from months of stressful work and school. We needed to get away from the city, disconnect from everything, and explore something different. That's when Jake came across a small town called Whispering Hollow. It was located deep in the forest, away from civilization, and it seemed like the perfect place to escape for a couple of days. A place where no one could find us. The drive to the village was long, winding through miles of dense woods. As we got closer, the air grew colder, and the once clear skies turned overcast. The trees along the roadside seemed to stretch higher and higher, their gnarled branches intertwining above us like fingers. The whole place felt suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on us. When we finally arrived, we noticed that Whispering Hollow was nothing like the picturesque village Jake had shown us online. It was small, but not in the charming way we'd imagined. The houses were run down, their windows covered in grime, and the streets were eerily empty. The few people we saw had hollow eyes and pale faces, their stares lingering just a little too long as we passed. It felt like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. Ignoring the strange vibes, we checked into an old bed and breakfast run by a woman named Mrs. Granger. She was an older lady, with sharp features and deep lines etched into her face, but she was polite enough. The place had a musty, old smell to it, like the kind of house that had seen better days. Mrs. Granger handed us our keys with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You'll find the forest lovely this time of year," she said, her voice soft and eerie. "But remember, there's a tradition in Whispering Hollow. The forest has its rules." Her words didn't register at first, and we shrugged them off as nothing more than the usual small-town superstition. But I should have known right then that we were being warned. We spent the day hiking around the village, taking pictures and admiring the autumn colors. But as night fell, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods surrounding the town seemed to stretch forever, and the shadows beneath the trees were unnaturally deep. We decided to return to the bed and breakfast and have dinner, hoping that a warm meal would calm our nerves. That evening, as we sat down to eat, we overheard a conversation between Mrs. Granger and another man who had just entered the dining room. He was thin, with a weathered face, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. The man was asking Mrs. Granger about something called the Gathering. The Gathering? The word sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Mrs. Granger lowered her voice, but I could still hear her reply. "The ritual will begin soon," she said. "We must be ready. The forest does not forgive." The man nodded, and Mrs. Granger turned back to her cooking, but I couldn't stop thinking about what they had just said. A ritual? What were they talking about? I turned to my friends, who were also now looking uneasy. "We should leave," Jake said suddenly, his face pale. "This place is giving me a bad vibe." But it was too late. The village had already begun to feel like it was pulling us in, and despite the discomfort, we all agreed to stay for one more night. I should have trusted my instincts, but we were too curious. And curiosity, as I would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing. That night, as we lay in our rooms, I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I could hear faint whispers outside my window. I got up to investigate but saw nothing, just the same eerie stillness of the night. Then, out of nowhere, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced in my chest, and I could hear my breathing, fast and shallow. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but something told me that this town was hiding something much darker than just superstitions. The whispers grew louder. They were coming from the forest. I rushed to wake Jake, Mia, and Emma. "We need to get out of here," I said, panic in my voice. But when we tried to leave the bed and breakfast, we found the door was locked. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't open it. We were trapped. That's when we heard the chanting. It started faintly, like a low hum, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, from the woods. I looked out the window and saw a procession of figures moving through the trees. They were wearing long, tattered cloaks, their faces obscured by hoods. They carried lanterns, their flames flickering in the dark. It wasn't just a random group of people. These were the cultists of Whispering Hollow, the people who had been living in the village for centuries, bound to the forest, performing rituals to appease whatever dark force resided there. I felt my stomach churn as the realization hit me. This was their gathering. The ritual was happening tonight. We decided to make a run for it. We had no choice. The door still wouldn't budge, but we managed to break a window and climb out, the cold night air hitting us as we sprinted into the woods. But the forest was no sanctuary. The chanting grew louder, and soon, we found ourselves surrounded by the cultists. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and they didn't speak. They just moved in a circle, encroaching on us. I could hear their voices now, but they weren't speaking words. It was something older, something primal, a language I couldn't understand. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted, as though the earth itself was pulling me down. I stumbled and fell to my knees, my hands scraping against the dirt. I looked up and saw that the cultists had formed a circle around us. There was no escape. One of them stepped forward, a tall man whose face was obscured by his hood. He raised his arms, and the chanting stopped. There was a long silence before he spoke, his voice deep and resonant. "You've come too close to the truth, strangers," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "You've seen the gathering, and now you must join it." Before I could respond, one of the cultists grabbed Mia, pulling her into the center of the circle. She screamed, but it was swallowed by the chanting that began again, louder and more frantic than before. I tried to move, to break free, but it was as if invisible chains were holding me in place. "Stop! Let her go!" Jake shouted, but his voice cracked under the weight of the fear that had taken over us all. The leader raised a hand, and suddenly, the lanterns began to glow brighter. A low hum filled the air, vibrating in my chest. I felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around us. Then, the unthinkable happened. Mia's body went limp, and the chanting stopped. The leader of the cult smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of someone who had seen too many dark things to feel anything human. "The ritual is complete," he said. "The forest is satisfied." I don't know how I got away. One minute, I was standing there, paralyzed with fear, and the next, I was running through the woods, pushing past the trees, the distant chanting still echoing in my mind. By the time I reached the road, I had no idea where Jake, Emma, or Mia were. I didn't go back for them. I never returned to Whispering Hollow. I don't know what happened to my friends, and I don't ever want to know. But I've heard the rumors. People say the town is cursed, and those who stumble into its rituals are never the same. I still hear the whispers, sometimes, in the wind, in the dark, and every autumn, when the air turns cold and the trees begin to lose their leaves, I can't help but wonder, is the forest still calling? Has the gathering begun again? If you ever find yourself near Whispering Hollow, don't listen to the wind. Don't follow the whispers, because the forest has its rules, and once you break them, you're never truly free. It was supposed to be a normal weekend trip to clear our heads. My best friends, Alex, Rachel, and I had all been under a lot of stress lately. We decided to visit a quiet, little-known town in the middle of nowhere, a place far away from the noise of the city. The town of Ravensbrook, tucked in a valley surrounded by thick, ancient woods, seemed like the perfect spot for a retreat. Little did we know, Ravensbrook had a dark secret, one that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. It was late Friday afternoon when we arrived. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. The town felt abandoned, like something out of an old horror film. Most of the buildings were old and worn down, with peeling paint and cracked windows. We checked into the only inn in town, a small, run-down place called the Hollow Inn, and the old man at the desk greeted us with a hollow smile. "Welcome to Ravensbrook," he said, his voice raspy. "I hope you enjoy your stay, though it's best not to venture out too far once the sun sets." We shrugged off his warning as superstition, and after settling into our rooms, we decided to explore the town. There was something about Ravensbrook that felt off, but we chalked it up to the isolation. There was no cell service, and the town seemed stuck in time, a place that had been untouched by modern life. We walked down the main street, passing by empty storefronts and overgrown gardens. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves and the creaking of old wood. The entire town seemed deserted, but we didn't mind. It gave the place a strange charm. That is, until we reached the end of the street. At the edge of town, there was a narrow path leading into the woods. It was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and vines, but something about it pulled us in. Alex, always the adventurous one, suggested we take a quick walk into the forest before dinner. We agreed, thinking it would be a fun way to pass the time. As we walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the trees grew taller, their branches intertwining above us to block out the sunlight. The forest was dense, and the ground beneath our feet was damp, as though it hadn't seen the sun in years. We joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but the further we walked, the heavier the air became. It was as though something was watching us, something hidden deep in the forest. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. In the center was a large, moss-covered stone. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. There were strange symbols carved into its surface, symbols we didn't recognize. At first, we thought it was some kind of old burial marker, but the closer we got, the more unsettling it became. Rachel was the first to notice something odd. There were small piles of rocks surrounding the stone, arranged in a perfect circle. The piles weren't random. They were meticulously placed, as though they had been arranged with a purpose. Alex stepped closer to the stone, reaching out to touch it, but I pulled him back. "Something's not right," I whispered. "We should head back." But it was too late. As we turned to leave, we heard it, a low hum, coming from deep within the forest. It was a sound like nothing I had ever heard before. Soft, melodic, yet somehow disturbing. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We froze, our eyes scanning the trees around us, but there was nothing there, just the deep, unsettling silence of the forest. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, and its face was hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move, but it was there, watching us. I felt a sudden wave of dread wash over me. Without saying a word, we turned and ran back toward the town, the sound of the hum growing louder in our ears. It was chasing us, I was sure of it. When we reached the inn, we slammed the door shut behind us, our hearts pounding. We were breathless, shaking, and I could tell that Rachel and Alex were just as terrified as I was. "Did you see it?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "That thing in the woods?" "I don't know what it was," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't human. We all sat in silence for a long time, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. It wasn't just our imagination. There was something out there, something ancient and dangerous, and it was connected to the town of Ravensbrook. Later that night, we decided to go to the local pub to try and calm our nerves. The place was dimly lit, with low wooden beams and an old fireplace that crackled softly. It was the only place in town that seemed to have any life to it. The bartender, a grizzled man with a thick beard, poured us drinks in silence, casting occasional glances at us over his shoulder. "First time in Ravensbrook?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. We nodded, exchanging uneasy looks. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke again. "You shouldn't be out in the woods after dark," he said. "People here, we have our traditions. You don't understand what goes on in those woods. It's better if you stay inside. Trust me." His warning was cryptic, but it made my stomach churn. I wanted to ask more, but the bartender's expression made it clear that he wasn't going to say any more. We finished our drinks in silence, the unease growing between us. As we were about to leave, an older woman entered the pub. She was hunched over, her eyes dark and hollow. Her face was lined with age, and her clothes were old-fashioned, like she'd stepped out of another time. She walked straight up to our table, her eyes never leaving mine. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "The stone in the woods, the markings, the hum." We nodded, too afraid to speak. "They know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The cult, they are watching. They're always watching. You must leave, before it's too late." Before we could ask what she meant, she turned and left the pub, vanishing into the night. That night, we barely slept. We kept the lights on in our rooms and locked the doors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for us. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside, made my heart race. I kept hearing the hum in my head, that awful melodic sound, and I couldn't help but think of the old woman's words. The cult is watching. The next morning, we packed our things and made plans to leave. We'd had enough. But as we were about to head out, the innkeeper stopped us at the door. "You can't leave yet," he said, his face grave. "The gathering is tonight. You're not supposed to be here when it happens." "The gathering?" Alex asked, confused. "The cult," the innkeeper said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They meet every year, when the moon is full. They summon something from the forest. Something old. Something dark." Before we could respond, the innkeeper turned and walked away, leaving us standing in the doorway. We exchanged uneasy glances. We knew we had to get out of Ravensbrook, but the road was blocked. Trees had fallen overnight, forming a barrier between us and the rest of the world. We were trapped. As night fell, the air grew colder. The town grew eerily quiet. And then, we heard it, the hum. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer, as though it was surrounding us. I could hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. We peered out the window and saw the cloaked figures, the cultists, walking toward the woods. There were more of them now, dozens, all heading toward the stone. And then, they stopped. They turned to face us, their faces hidden beneath their hoods, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You shouldn't have come," one of them said, his voice a low, guttural growl. I didn't understand what he meant, but the fear in his voice was enough to make me tremble. The cultists raised their arms in unison, and the ground beneath us seemed to shake. The hum reached a crescendo, filling my ears and rattling my bones. I could see shadows moving in the trees, figures emerging from the darkness. The ritual had begun, and I knew, deep down, that we had become part of something far darker than we could ever imagine. We never made it out of Ravensbrook. They say that once you witness the cult's gathering, you become part of it, whether you want to or not. Some say we're still there, wandering the woods, lost forever, trapped in the forest's curse. If you ever find yourself near Ravensbrook, don't venture into the woods. Don't listen to the hum, and don't follow the cloaked figures. Because once you hear their chant, once you see the stone, it's already too late. And if you look closely, you might see us watching from the shadows, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake we did. When my parents moved us to the countryside, I thought it would be a fresh start. After all, who wouldn't want to escape the chaos of the city and breathe the fresh air of a quiet village? But it didn't take long for me to realize that this rural town was hiding something far darker than I could ever have imagined. The village of Black Hollow was nestled at the foot of an ancient forest. It was small, just a few winding roads, a handful of cottages, and a couple of old businesses that seemed to be stuck in time. The people were friendly enough, though they always looked at newcomers with a certain wariness. I found that unsettling but pushed it aside, thinking it was just the oddity of small-town life. The last thing I expected was to uncover the terrifying truth hidden beneath the surface. It all started with an invitation. A few weeks after we arrived, I was introduced to some of the local teenagers. They seemed nice enough at first, and before long, I was spending time with them after school. There was Sam, a quiet boy with wild hair who seemed to always be reading, and Ava, a girl with sharp eyes and a quick smile. They told me about the village's history, the ancient forests surrounding it, and the strange traditions that had been passed down for generations. One afternoon, after a long walk through the woods, Sam brought up something I'd never heard of before. "You know," he said, looking around cautiously, "the Hollow isn't just a name. It's more than a village. It's a place where things happen." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Ava shot Sam a warning look, but he ignored her. "There's an old ritual. Something that's been happening here for centuries." I was intrigued. "A ritual? What kind of ritual?" Sam glanced around again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The villagers here have always believed in something ancient. They call it the Awakening. It's a ceremony that happens every few decades in the deep parts of the forest. They say it's meant to bring someone, back to life. Back to life." I repeated, my curiosity peaked. "Like a resurrection?" Ava's face darkened. "More like an offering," she said quietly. "And you don't want to be around when it happens." My heart skipped a beat. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. But I couldn't help but ask, "What do you mean? What happens during this awakening?" Sam leaned in closer, his eyes full of fear and excitement. "It's a blood ritual. They sacrifice someone to summon whatever it is they worship. I don't know all the details, but it's enough to know that it's not something you want to get involved with." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the tension that was building in my chest. "That sounds like an old myth." Ava didn't laugh. She was serious. "It's not. My family has been here for generations. We don't talk about it, but we all know. And we all stay far away from the forest when the time comes." I didn't understand what they were trying to warn me about, but something about the way they spoke made it clear they weren't joking. This was real. I was still skeptical, but I couldn't help but feel an eerie sense of dread as I walked back home that day. Over the next few days, I tried to shake off what they had told me, but it wasn't easy. Every time I passed the forest or looked at the ancient stone walls that marked the boundary of the village, I felt a strange pull, like I was being drawn to something I shouldn't be near. Then, one evening, I found myself alone in the woods. I had gotten lost while hiking, trying to explore a part of the forest I hadn't seen before. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted, their branches so thick they blocked out the sun. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the air became. I felt like something was watching me. That's when I saw it, the clearing. At first, it seemed like an ordinary patch of open land, but as I stepped closer, I realized something was wrong. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, worn by time, but still unmistakably a place of ritual. The stones around it were arranged in a perfect circle, and there, in the center, were more carvings, symbols I didn't recognize. Some of them looked like old runes, others like crude depictions of human figures. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and an overwhelming sense of unease settled over me. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A sound, the unmistakable sound of chanting. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the wind, but as I stood frozen, it grew louder, clearer. I couldn't understand the words, but the rhythm of the chant sent a cold chill through my veins. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized it was coming from the forest, deeper into the woods, from the direction of the village. Before I could move, a shadow passed over me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Yet, the feeling of being watched intensified. I quickly ran out of the clearing and headed back to the village, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The chant had followed me, echoing in my mind. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon, but I knew one thing. I had to find out more. The next day, I asked Sam and Ava about what I had found. I could see the fear in their eyes when I told them about the altar in the forest. "You shouldn't have gone there," Sam said, his voice shaking. "It's one of the sites. The ritual happens there." Ava's face was pale. "The awakening. It's happening soon. You shouldn't be anywhere near the forest when it does." I didn't know what they meant by soon, but I could tell that whatever was going on, it was dangerous. I decided I needed to get to the bottom of it. So I did what any curious teenager would do. I went to the library. The town library was small, dusty, and smelled like old paper. The librarian was an elderly woman with thick glasses, and when I asked her about the history of Black Hollow, she gave me a strange look before leading me to the local history section. There, I found a book, The History of Black Hollow and Its Forgotten Rituals. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it, and as I read, I began to piece together the chilling story of the village. The book described the origins of Black Hollow, founded by settlers who believed in ancient, forgotten gods. Over time, their belief evolved into the practice of summoning an entity, an ancient being they called the Hollow One. To awaken it, they had to sacrifice a life, a person chosen by the village elders. The ritual was meant to ensure the prosperity of the village, to bring good crops and protection from illness. But over the years, fewer people wanted to participate, and the ritual became a closely guarded secret. That was until the awakening, which came every 30 years. The elders chose a person from the village, a stranger, a wanderer, or anyone they could lure into their web. They would bring them to the clearing, bind them to the altar, and offer them to the Hollow One to awaken its power. The final line of the book was the most chilling of all. Once the ritual begins, there is no turning back. The Hollow One will claim its prize, and the village will remain safe for another generation. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. I had become a part of something far darker than I could ever have imagined. The forest, the altar, the chant. It was all part of the ritual, and I was in the middle of it. That night, I tried to leave. I packed my things, convinced that I had to escape before it was too late. But when I stepped outside, the village had changed. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. No one was on the streets, and the houses seemed abandoned. As I walked toward the edge of the village, I heard the chanting again, louder than ever. This time, it wasn't in the distance. It was right behind me. I turned around, and there they were. The villagers, cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadow. They had been waiting for me. "You shouldn't have come," one of them said, stepping forward. "The ritual has already begun," and as I looked around, I realized something terrifying. I had become part of the offering. I never made it out of Black Hollow. They say the village still exists, hidden deep in the forest, and that every 30 years, the ritual is performed again. And if you find yourself lost in the woods near Black Hollow, listen carefully to the wind. If you hear the chanting, it's already too late. You're part of the ritual now. And if you see the villagers in their cloaks, remember this. They are watching, waiting for the next soul to awaken the Hollow One. And once you've been chosen, there's no escape. I always thought I had a pretty good sense of the world around me. But then again, I never knew how little I really understood about the depths of darkness until that fateful summer. I was just a kid, about to turn 17, when my family moved to the small town of Ravenbrook. It was a town that seemed peaceful at first. Just like any other sleepy little village tucked away in the middle of nowhere, Ravenbrook was surrounded by tall, dense woods, the kind that gave you a sense of quiet unease as soon as you entered. I remember driving in on the old highway, past trees that seemed to grow closer together, as though they were watching. The town itself was small, just a few streets, a gas station, a post office, and a couple of stores that had seen better days. But it was the kind of place that you'd call charming if you were an outsider. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. Until it did. It all started one afternoon when I was exploring the woods nearby. I had always loved being out in nature, and this was the perfect spot for a hike. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon an area I had never seen before. The trees here were older, their branches twisted and knotted like the fingers of ancient hands. In the center of the clearing was an abandoned stone structure, what looked like an old, decaying chapel. I felt a strange pull to go closer. As I approached the chapel, I noticed the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. Some of them were carved into the stone, while others seemed to have been burned into the walls. There was a feeling of heaviness in the air, like the weight of something forgotten and forbidden. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped inside. The inside of the chapel was dark and musty. The air smelled stale, as though it had been shut off from the world for decades. The floor was covered in dust, and the wooden pews were broken, as though they had been abandoned in haste. But what caught my attention was the altar at the far end of the room. It was an altar, but not like any I had ever seen before. It was made of smooth, black stone, and there were remnants of candles scattered around it. But what was truly unsettling were the markings on the altar itself. It wasn't just the same strange symbols. There were also bloodstains, dark, dried streaks that had been there for far longer than any accident could account for. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. I should have turned around and run, but instead, I stayed, staring at the altar. That's when I heard the sound, a low, guttural chant. I froze, my mind racing. The chant was coming from somewhere deep within the forest. It wasn't loud at first, but as I listened, it grew louder, closer. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but the more I heard it, the more real it felt. The words were in a language I didn't understand, but they were unmistakable, and they were getting closer. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. From the shadows emerged a group of people, all wearing dark, tattered robes. Their faces were hidden, their features obscured by the hoods that covered their heads. They moved in a slow, deliberate procession, as if they had been waiting for me. I tried to speak, to ask what was going on, but my voice caught in my throat. The leader of the group, a tall figure with a scarred face, stepped forward. His eyes glowed faintly, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding. "You are here now. The ritual must be completed." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was already beginning to understand. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised his hands, and the chanting grew louder, almost deafening. It felt as if the air itself was vibrating with an unseen power. "We are the children of the Forgotten One," the man said, his voice like ice. "You've stumbled into our sacred ground, and now you are part of the offering." I was trembling, unsure if this was some sort of sick joke, or if they were truly serious. "Offering?" I managed to ask. He nodded grimly. "The Forgotten One must be appeased. Every 7 years, a life must be given. A life that is innocent, untainted by the world. And now, you are the one chosen." I shook my head. "This is insane. I don't want any part of this." The group closed in around me, their eyes glowing with a strange light. "You have no choice," the leader said softly. "You are the offering." I don't know how long I was in the chapel, but when I came to my senses, the group was gone. The chanting had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled to my feet, my mind racing. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? Or had something far darker truly occurred in those woods? I ran back to the town, my legs shaking beneath me. As I neared the edge of the woods, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw them. The figures, still in their robes, standing at the entrance to the forest. They watched me, their eyes gleaming in the fading light. There was no mistaking it. They were real, and they were waiting for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside my window made me jump. Every shadow in my room seemed to watch me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The following days were a blur. I tried to tell my family about what happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. "It's just a local superstition," my father said. "People make up these stories to scare tourists. Don't let it get to you." But I knew better. I had seen the ritual. I had been part of it. On the 5th night after my encounter, I went back to the chapel. I couldn't help myself. I needed to know the truth. I needed to see if it was all in my mind, or if something much worse was lurking in those woods. When I arrived, the chapel was silent, but the air felt different. The forest felt alive with a sinister energy, and as I stepped inside the chapel, I noticed something new. The altar was no longer empty. There, lying on the stone, was a small, unmarked grave, and on the grave, fresh bloodstains. It was then that I realized I wasn't the first one to be chosen, and I wouldn't be the last. The ritual, the offering, it had been happening for generations. The children of the Forgotten One were not just a group of crazed individuals. They were part of something much older, something far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. The ritual was about more than appeasing a god. It was about survival, about ensuring that the town of Ravenbrook continued to thrive while the rest of the world withered away. They had sacrificed countless others, all to keep the darkness at bay, all to keep the Forgotten One from escaping. And now, I was part of that bloodline, part of the offering that would continue the cycle. Days passed, and the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I turned a corner, I would see them, those robed figures, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I knew they were coming for me, but no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, there was no escaping them. I had become the offering, and now, I too was one of the Forgotten Ones. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, I realized the terrifying truth. Once you become part of the ritual, there's no turning back. The Forgotten One will always demand its offering. And in Ravenbrook, there's no such thing as escape. If you ever find yourself driving through the forest near Ravenbrook, don't stop. Don't wander into the woods. And if you hear chanting in the distance, don't turn back. Because once you do, it might be too late. The offering has already been made. And it's you. The Forgotten Ones are always waiting, and they will always come for you. The summer of my 18th year was supposed to be a time of freedom. I had just graduated high school and was eager to escape the small, stifling town of Blackwater. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Blackwater was surrounded by forests so dense they swallowed the sun. At its heart was Blackwater Lake, a sprawling, eerily calm body of water with a reputation no one dared to discuss openly. Stay away from the lake after dark, my mother had always warned. It's not safe. She never elaborated, and I'd always chalked it up to old town superstition. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and when my friends dared me to camp by the lake, I couldn't resist. It wasn't just about proving my bravery. It was about unraveling the mystery that seemed to shroud the entire town. We set out on a Friday afternoon, a group of 5. Me, my best friend Lucas, his girlfriend Mia, and our mutual friends, Sarah and Ben. Armed with tents, snacks, and flashlights, we arrived at the lake just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The water reflected the orange and pink hues of the sky, creating an almost serene picture. Almost. There was something off about the lake, even in the daylight. The air felt heavy, and the forest surrounding it was unnervingly quiet. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. It was as if nature itself avoided this place. Creepy, right? Lucas joked, trying to lighten the mood. Mia nudged him. Don't start. It's just a lake. But even Mia couldn't hide her unease as we set up camp near the shoreline. The silence was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on our chests. Still, we laughed and joked, trying to push away the growing sense of dread. By the time night fell, the lake was pitch black, its surface disturbingly still. We lit a campfire and sat in a circle, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. It was almost enough to make us forget where we were. Almost. It started with a sound, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo from the forest. We all froze, our laughter dying instantly. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered. Ben shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. Probably just animals, but we all knew better. The sound wasn't natural. It was too deliberate, too human. The drumming grew louder, closer. Then came the chanting, low and guttural, like a dozen voices speaking in unison. The language was unlike anything I'd ever heard, the words twisting and curling in ways that made my skin crawl. What the hell is that? Mia asked, her voice trembling. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and stood. Stay here. I'll check it out. No way, I said, standing too. We stick together. Reluctantly, the others followed, and we ventured into the forest, the light of our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The drumming and chanting led us deeper and deeper until we stumbled upon a clearing. That's when we saw them. They were standing in a circle around a massive stone altar, a group of figures cloaked in tattered black robes. Their faces were obscured by masks, grotesque, twisted visages that seemed to mock humanity. The altar was slick with something dark and wet, and on it lay a writhing figure, a young woman, her screams muffled by a gag. "Oh my God!" Sarah gasped, and I quickly clamped a hand over her mouth. The robed figures didn't seem to notice us, their focus entirely on the ritual. They chanted louder, raising their arms in unison as the drumming reached a fever pitch. The woman's struggles grew weaker, and I realized with horror that her blood was pooling beneath her, dripping into a series of carved grooves that led into the earth. "What do we do?" Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to stop them," Lucas said, his voice shaking but resolute. Before any of us could protest, he burst into the clearing, brandishing a branch like a weapon. "Hey, stop!" The chanting ceased abruptly, and the figures turned to face us in eerie unison. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of our flashlights. Then the leader stepped forward, a tall figure with a mask shaped like a snarling beast. "You should not be here," he said, his voice deep and distorted. "Let her go," Lucas demanded. The leader tilted his head, almost amused. "You do not understand. She is the key." "The key to what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "To keeping the darkness at bay," he replied. "The lake demands its offering." Before we could react, the robed figures surged toward us. Chaos erupted as we scattered, running blindly through the forest. I could hear Mia screaming, Sarah crying, Lucas shouting. My heart pounded as I stumbled over roots and branches, the sound of footsteps close behind. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found myself back at the lake. The water glowed faintly under the moonlight, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw it. Something was rising from the water, something massive and unnatural. Its shape was impossible to describe, a shifting mass of darkness and tendrils that writhed like living shadows. Two glowing eyes emerged from the void, fixing on me with a hunger that froze me in place. The chanting resumed, louder and more frantic. The figures had gathered at the shore, their arms raised as they called to the creature. And then I understood. The lake didn't just demand offerings, it was alive. A living entity that fed on blood and fear. The ritual wasn't to keep the darkness at bay, it was to keep it sated. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I had to do something. But what? Lucas's voice rang out behind me. "Run, Ellie." I turned to see him and the others emerging from the forest, the robed figures close behind. "We have to stop it," he yelled. "How?" I shouted back, but Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a burning branch from the campfire and hurled it at the altar. Flames erupted, spreading quickly across the dry wood and stone. The chanting faltered, replaced by panicked cries. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, its form writhing in pain as the flames consumed its altar. The robed figures tried to extinguish the fire, but it was too late. The flames spread to the surrounding forest, illuminating the scene in a hellish glow. "Go," Lucas shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran along the shoreline, the heat of the fire at our backs. The creature thrashed, its form beginning to collapse into itself as the flames consumed its source of power. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. By then, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. Did we stop it?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded, though his face was grim. "For now." "What do you mean, for now?" Sarah demanded. Lucas looked back toward the forest, where smoke still rose in the distance. "That thing. It's been here for centuries. The ritual was just a way to keep it from spreading. We might have destroyed the altar, but I don't think we destroyed it. We never spoke about that night again. The town claimed the fire was caused by careless campers, and no one seemed to question it. But we knew the truth. The lake still sits at the heart of Blackwater, its surface calm and unbroken. But sometimes, late at night, you can hear the faint sound of drums echoing through the forest. And if you look closely, You might see the shadows moving beneath the water. I didn't believe the stories at first. Nobody ever does, right? They say every small town has its secrets, but Grafton, Pennsylvania, seemed to have buried theirs deep enough to be forgotten. Or so I thought. The trouble began when my younger brother, Nate, became obsessed with an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. St. Gideon's Chapel had been abandoned for decades, its rotting wood and shattered stained glass a testament to time and neglect. It was said to have been built in the 1800s, but no one could agree on why it was abandoned. Some claimed a fire had gutted it. Others whispered of a scandal involving the church's last pastor. Nate and I loved exploring old places, but even I drew the line at St. Gideon's. There was something wrong about it. The way the trees around it seemed to twist unnaturally, the eerie silence that fell as you approached. Nate, of course, dismissed my concerns. "It's just an old building, Laura," he'd say, rolling his eyes. "What's the worst that could happen?" One Saturday, Nate convinced me to go with him. "Just for an hour," he promised. "I found something there, and I want to show you." Reluctantly, I agreed. We set off in the late afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows over the dirt road leading to the chapel. By the time we arrived, the air had grown colder, and the building loomed before us like a skeleton of its former self. Nate led me inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Yet, there was an odd beauty to it. Broken pews scattered like fallen soldiers, beams of light filtering through cracked stained glass. "Over here," Nate said, his voice low. He led me to the pulpit, where a trapdoor lay partially open. "Found it last week," he said, grinning. "There's a whole basement down there. You won't believe what's inside." We descended into the dark, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The air grew colder, and the scent of damp earth mixed with something metallic. Blood, perhaps. At the bottom, the space opened into a cavernous room. The walls were lined with crumbling stone, and in the center stood an altar, covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. Around the room were dozens of wooden benches, arranged as though for an audience. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Nate shone his flashlight on the altar. "Look closer." I approached reluctantly, my skin prickling with unease. On the altar lay an old, leather-bound book, its cover adorned with the same strange symbols. I reached out to touch it, but Nate grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he said. "I tried that last time. It's weird." "Weird how?" "Just watch." Nate flipped open the book with a stick, careful not to touch it directly. The pages were filled with writing in a language I didn't recognize, interspersed with crude drawings of figures in black robes and what looked like rituals. "What is this place?" I asked again, my voice trembling. Nate hesitated. I think it's a cult. We should have left then and there, but something compelled us to stay. Curiosity? Stupidity? I don't know. We spent hours examining the room, finding more and more unsettling details. Chains bolted to the walls, old bones scattered in the corners, and a mural painted on the far wall. The mural depicted a choir of robed figures standing before a massive figure, something humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its eyes too many, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Beneath the mural was an inscription: "The choir of Gideon sings eternal, lest the keeper awaken." "What does that mean?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to find out," I replied, grabbing his arm. "Let's go." But as we turned to leave, a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, like a distant wind, but it grew louder and more insistent. "Do you hear that?" Nate asked, his flashlight flickering. "Yeah, let's move." We scrambled up the stairs, the hum growing louder with each step. By the time we reached the main hall, it had transformed into a chorus, dozens of voices humming in perfect harmony. Then we saw them. They stood in the pews, robed figures with faces obscured by shadow. They hadn't been there when we arrived, and yet, there they were, humming that eerie, monotonous tune. "What the hell is going on?" Nate hissed, panic in his voice. The figures turned toward us in unison, their heads tilting unnaturally. One stepped forward, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. "You have disturbed the choir," it said, its voice layered with echoes. "The keeper stirs. What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "To finish the hymn," it replied. Without warning, the room plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting brief, chaotic glimpses of the figures closing in. I grabbed Nate's hand and bolted for the door, my heart pounding. The moment we stepped outside, the humming stopped. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that pressed down on you, heavy and oppressive. "We need to tell someone," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Who?" Nate replied, his voice shaking. "Who would believe us?" He had a point. What could we say? That we'd found an underground cult room and been chased by ghostly figures? No one would take us seriously. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mural, the robed figures, the keeper. Around midnight, I heard a soft hum. It started faint, like it had in the basement, but it grew louder, closer. I looked out my window and saw them, robed figures standing in the street, their faces turned toward my house. I ran to Nate's room, only to find his bed empty. Panic surged as I bolted downstairs and out the door, following the sound of the hum. It led me back to the chapel. The figures were there, gathered around the altar. Nate was with them, his face blank, his movements mechanical as he joined the chant. "Nate!" I screamed, running toward him. The figures turned to me, their voices rising in unison. "The hymn must be finished." "No," I shouted. "Let him go." But it was too late. The keeper's mural began to glow, and the walls trembled. The figure in the painting moved, its grotesque form pushing through the stone as though it were a portal. I grabbed the book from the altar, desperate for anything that might stop the ritual. Flipping through the pages, I found a chant written in red ink. It was the only thing written in English. "Break the choir, bind the keeper." I screamed the words, my voice drowning out the humming. The figures writhed and screamed as if in pain, their forms flickering like static. The keeper let out a deafening roar, its form retreating back into the mural. The robed figures collapsed, dissolving into ash. Nate fell to the ground, unconscious but alive. We burned the book and sealed the trapdoor before leaving the chapel for good. Nate never spoke of what happened that night, and neither did I. St. Gideon still stands, a hollow shell of its former self. But if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear it, the faint hum of the forgotten choir, waiting for someone foolish enough to finish the hymn. When my Uncle Richard passed away, my family inherited his old estate, Hawthorne Manor. The place had always been the subject of whispered rumors in our family, tales of strange gatherings and secretive visitors during my uncle's reclusive life. I never thought much of it until I was tasked with cataloging his belongings. I had just finished my first year of college, and the promise of a quiet summer in the countryside seemed appealing. My parents, too busy with their own lives, insisted I take care of the task alone. "It'll be good for you," my mother had said. The manor was a towering structure, its brick walls covered in creeping ivy and its windows dark like vacant eyes. Despite its outward charm, the inside was unsettling. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and the air smelled stale, like a tomb that had been sealed for years. I spent the first few days sorting through books, papers, and an assortment of odd trinkets. Uncle Richard had an interest in the occult, evident in the numerous books on mysticism and rituals lining his shelves. Most of it seemed harmless, albeit a little eccentric, until I found the journal. Bound in cracked leather, the journal was hidden beneath a false bottom in his desk. The pages were filled with Richard's cramped handwriting, detailing bizarre experiments and rituals. He wrote about the Order of the Veil, a secret society he claimed to be part of. According to him, they had uncovered a way to pierce the fabric of reality and summon beings from beyond. I laughed it off at first. It read like the ramblings of a madman. But as the days went on, I began to notice strange things. At night, I heard faint whispers in the hallways, though I was certain I was alone. Doors creaked open on their own, and shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. One evening, as I was sorting through a stack of papers in the study, I found a key tucked inside an envelope. Attached was a note in my uncle's handwriting. For the cellar, do not enter unless you are prepared. I debated leaving the key where I found it, but curiosity got the better of me. The cellar door was at the far end of the kitchen, hidden behind a tattered curtain. It was locked with a heavy iron padlock, which clicked open with the key. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the scent of mildew and something metallic. I descended the creaking wooden stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cellar was larger than I expected, with stone walls and a dirt floor. At the center was a circle etched into the ground, surrounded by strange symbols. Candles, long melted into stubs, were placed at intervals around it. On a nearby table lay an assortment of tools, knives, bowls, and a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. As I examined the book, I felt a presence behind me. Whipping around, I found nothing but darkness. My heart raced as I returned my attention to the book, its title etched in gold, The Sable Grimoire. I opened it with trembling hands, revealing pages filled with detailed instructions for rituals. Most of it was illegible, written in a language I couldn't recognize, but one page had a translation scrawled in the margins. The binding of the veil requires blood, devotion, and sacrifice. The circle must be pure, the chant uninterrupted. The veil will open, and the shadow will come forth. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What had my uncle been involved in? That night, I dreamed of the cellar. I saw my uncle standing within the circle, chanting in a voice that wasn't his own. Shadows writhed around him, coalescing into a towering figure with hollow eyes and outstretched arms. The thing reached for him, and I woke up gasping for air. I told myself it was just my imagination, a byproduct of reading too much into my uncle's bizarre journal. But the whispers in the house grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just murmurs, they were voices calling my name. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered the journal and the grimoire, intending to burn them in the fireplace. As I stood before the roaring flames, the shadows in the room seemed to twist and pulse. "You shouldn't do that," a voice whispered. I spun around, but no one was there. My hands trembled as I tossed the books into the fire. They didn't burn. The flames licked at the pages, but the books remained untouched. Instead, the shadows in the room grew darker, denser, until they seemed to spill out of the walls. The lights flickered and went out. The only illumination came from the fire, which now burned an unnatural blue. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, tall, thin, and featureless. They surrounded me, their hollow faces staring without eyes. "You opened the veil," one of them hissed. "No, I didn't," I cried, backing away. "You are his blood," another said. "The pact is yours to bear." I realized they weren't speaking about me. They were talking about my uncle. Whatever he had done, whatever he had summoned, had bound itself to his lineage. I ran to the cellar, driven by a desperate need to end this nightmare. The circle was still there, glowing faintly in the darkness. I grabbed the grimoire from where I had left it and searched for a way to reverse the ritual. The book provided no answers. The pages were blank, as though mocking my attempts. The shadows gathered at the edges of the room, watching me. "You cannot undo what was done," they said in unison. "The shadow feeds. What do you want?" I demanded. "Completion," they replied. I didn't understand what they meant until I saw the dagger on the table. My uncle had written about a final offering in his journal, something he hadn't completed before his death. I knew what they were asking of me, but I refused. "I won't do it," I said, clutching the dagger. "Then we will take it," they said, advancing toward me. The shadows closed in, their forms shifting and writhing. I slashed at them with the dagger, but it passed through them like smoke. Their hands, cold and insubstantial, gripped my arms, pulling me toward the circle. In a last-ditch effort, I recited the chant I had seen in the grimoire. "By blood, by bond, I seal the veil. By light, by will, I banish the shadow." The room shook violently, and the shadow screamed. The circle flared with a blinding light, and the figures disintegrated into ash. When the light faded, the cellar was empty. The circle was gone. The tools and books vanished. It was as though the ritual had never existed. I left the manor that night, vowing never to return. My parents sold the property, and I didn't argue. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like a memory refusing to fade. And I wonder, did I truly banish the shadow, or is it still waiting, biding its time, for another to open the veil? It started as an innocent school assignment, a deep dive into local history. For my senior history project, I decided to research a little-known legend in my small town of Ravenswood. My teacher, Mr. Bennett, suggested the topic. The silent choir, he said with a knowing smirk. Plenty of material there. Ravenswood had always been shrouded in mystery, with abandoned buildings and unmarked graves scattered around the outskirts. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the forest just beyond town, warning me to never go near it after dark. The choir might find you, she'd whisper with a quiver in her voice. I always assumed it was just another bedtime story meant to scare me into behaving, but as I started digging, I realized there was more to it than I'd ever imagined. The silent choir, as the story went, was a secretive group that had existed in Ravenswood over a century ago. They were rumored to hold rituals in the woods, offering up songs and sacrifices to the Watcher, a deity or spirit that supposedly granted power in exchange for devotion. My research led me to the town archives, where I found old newspaper clippings and journal entries that painted a chilling picture. Reports of missing people, strange lights in the woods, and a sudden, unexplained fire that had burned down a church where the choir was said to have gathered. The townsfolk at the time had blamed the choir for everything, calling them witches and devil worshippers. The legend claimed they had all perished in the fire, but some believed their spirits lingered, still singing their haunting melodies deep in the forest. I didn't think much of the stories until I interviewed Mrs. Hawthorne, the oldest resident of Ravenswood. At 94, she had lived through much of the town's history and had a reputation for being a bit eccentric. When I mentioned the silent choir, her face turned ashen. "You shouldn't be looking into them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not?" I asked, curious. "They don't like being disturbed," she said, clutching the rosary around her neck. "The choir never left. They're waiting." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed them off as the ramblings of an old woman. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was delving into something I wasn't meant to. A few nights later, I decided to visit the woods where the choir was said to have performed their rituals. Armed with a flashlight, my notebook, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I set out just after sunset. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. I followed an old, overgrown path I'd found in one of the archive maps, leading to a clearing where the choir supposedly gathered. When I reached the clearing, my flashlight illuminated a circle of moss-covered stones arranged like an altar. Strange symbols were carved into the stones, their edges worn but still visible. In the center of the circle was a stone slab, stained dark with what I hoped was just the passage of time. I felt a sudden chill, as though the air around me had grown heavier. Then I heard it, a faint hum, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. The hum grew louder, transforming into a haunting melody. It wasn't coming from any particular direction, but seemed to envelop the entire clearing. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, but I saw no one. Then I noticed the shadows. They moved unnaturally, shifting and twisting as though alive. Shapes began to form within them. Figures draped in tattered robes, their faces obscured. The choir. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. One of the figures stepped forward, raising a hand in a silent command. The humming ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. "You disturb our sanctuary," a voice said, though no lips moved. It was deep and resonant, reverberating inside my skull. I didn't mean to," I stammered. The figure tilted its head, as if considering me. "You seek knowledge of the Watcher." "I was just curious," I said, my voice shaking. "It's for a school project. The figure's hood shifted, revealing a hollow void where a face should have been. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing," it said. The other figures began to chant, their voices blending into a discordant harmony that made my ears ache. The symbols on the stones glowed faintly, and the air grew colder. I tried to back away, but the shadows closed in around me, blocking any escape. "What do you want from me?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "To listen," the figure said. "To join." "No," I shouted, finally finding the strength to move. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I tore through the forest. The chants followed me, growing louder and more frantic. When I finally broke through the tree line and into the safety of the open field, the sounds stopped abruptly. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I thought I had escaped, but that night, the dreams began. I saw the choir, standing in the clearing, their chants weaving through my mind like a dark melody. In the center of their circle stood a towering figure cloaked in shadow, the Watcher. Its eyes were two pinpoints of light, staring directly into my soul. "You have seen," it said, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "You will return." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Over the next few days, the dreams grew more vivid, more demanding. The choir's song echoed in my ears even when I was awake, a constant reminder of what I had seen. Desperate to break free, I returned to Mrs. Hawthorne. She listened with a grave expression as I recounted my experience. "They've marked you," she said. "Once the choir calls, they don't stop." "What do I do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "There's only one way to silence them," she said. "You must destroy their altar." Armed with a sledgehammer and a lantern, I ventured back into the woods that night. The path to the clearing felt longer this time, the forest darker and more oppressive. When I reached the altar, the choir was waiting for me. Their shadowy forms stood motionless, their empty faces turned toward me. "You cannot break the bond," the leader said. "The Watcher will not be denied." Ignoring their warnings, I swung the sledgehammer at the central slab. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and the choir let out an ear-piercing shriek. The shadows writhed and convulsed, their forms dissolving into smoke as I smashed the stones one by one. With each swing, the choir's voices grew fainter, until they were nothing more than a whisper carried away by the wind. When the last stone was reduced to rubble, the forest fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. I left Ravenswood shortly after, moving away for college and never looking back. The dreams stopped, and the choir's song faded from my memory. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint hum in the distance, and I wonder, did I truly silence the choir? Or are they still waiting, their song ready to begin again? When I moved to the sleepy town of Black Hollow for college, I didn't expect much beyond lectures, assignments, and the occasional small-town charm. Nestled in the Appalachian foothills, Black Hollow felt like a place where time stood still. Old wooden houses, narrow cobblestone streets, and a dense forest encircling the town like a protective barrier. It wasn't long before I heard whispers about the midnight procession. At first, it seemed like one of those local legends townsfolk used to scare outsiders or amuse themselves. They said that once a year, on the night of the winter solstice, a mysterious group in dark robes walked through the forest, chanting in an ancient language. According to the stories, they were part of a centuries-old cult, performing rituals to keep the Shadow Lord from awakening. I laughed it off. After all, it sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. But then, I met Evelyn. Evelyn was a classmate, someone I hadn't paid much attention to until she overheard me joking about the midnight procession in the campus coffee shop. Her face turned pale, and she pulled me aside. "It's not a joke," she whispered. Her intensity caught me off guard. "Come on, Evelyn," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a story." She shook her head. "My uncle disappeared during the procession 10 years ago. He went into the forest to see for himself and never came back. That piqued my curiosity." "What do you mean? Like he just vanished?" Evelyn nodded. "He was never found, and he wasn't the only one. Every few years, Someone goes missing during the solstice. The police don't even investigate anymore. They just write it off as people getting lost in the woods. Her story stuck with me, though I tried to brush it off. But as the solstice approached, I found myself unable to resist the pull of the legend. On the night of December 21st, I decided to find out the truth. Armed with a flashlight, my phone, and a thermos of coffee, I headed into the woods. I told myself it was just for fun, a way to prove the legend was nothing more than small-town superstition. The forest was colder than I expected, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My breath came out in clouds as I followed the trail Evelyn had described, a narrow, winding path that led deep into the heart of the woods. An hour passed, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches like skeletal fingers against the night sky. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. But as I moved closer, it grew louder, more distinct. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, each syllable laced with an unnatural cadence. I switched off my flashlight, not wanting to announce my presence. The chanting was coming from a clearing up ahead, its edges illuminated by the flickering glow of firelight. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw made me freeze in place. A circle of hooded figures stood around a massive stone altar, their robes as black as the night itself. They each held a torch, the flames casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. On the altar lay a wooden effigy, carved in the shape of a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. The chanting reached a crescendo, and one of the figures stepped forward, holding a dagger with a blade that shimmered like liquid silver. I felt a surge of panic. What was I witnessing? Was this some sort of theater? A reenactment? But as the figure raised the dagger, I realized this was no performance. I tried to back away quietly, but my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. The sound of my fall echoed through the clearing. The chanting stopped abruptly, and every hooded head turned toward me. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the figure with the dagger pointed in my direction. "Bring the witness," it said in a voice that was both deep and hollow, as though it came from somewhere far away. I ran. The adrenaline coursing through my veins drowned out the sounds of pursuit, but I could feel them closing in. The forest, which had seemed so still and empty before, was now alive with the rustle of movement and the flicker of torchlight. My lungs burned as I pushed myself to keep going, the path ahead barely visible in the darkness. I stumbled over roots and rocks, each misstep costing me precious seconds. Just when I thought I had lost them, I broke through the trees and into another clearing, a dead end. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like a frozen scream. Carved into its trunk were the same strange symbols I had seen on the effigy. Before I could react, the hooded figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding me. Their torches cast a hellish glow on their expressionless masks, which were carved from polished wood and painted with jagged symbols. "You should not have come," the leader said, stepping forward. I tried to speak, to explain that I hadn't meant any harm, but the words caught in my throat. The leader gestured, and two of the figures grabbed me, dragging me toward the tree. They tied my wrists to the low-hanging branches, the rough bark digging into my skin. The leader stepped closer, raising the dagger. "You have seen what was meant to remain hidden," it said. "The Shadow Lord demands silence." I struggled against the bonds, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life. As the dagger's blade gleamed in the firelight, I acted on pure instinct. I kicked out, my foot connecting with the leader's knee. It staggered backward, and the figures holding me loosened their grip just enough for me to break free. I didn't think, I just ran. My body moved on autopilot, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter with each step. Somehow, I made it back to the edge of the forest. The town's lights were a distant but welcoming sight, and I didn't stop running until I was back in my dorm room, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blanket, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind sending waves of paranoia through me. The next morning, I tried to report what I'd seen to the local police, but they dismissed me with a patronizing smile. "Kids have been telling stories about the procession for decades," the officer said. "You probably just spooked yourself." I wanted to argue, to make them understand, but I realized it was pointless. Whatever I had witnessed, no one would believe me. Evelyn was the only one who listened, her expression grim as I recounted everything. "You're lucky you got away," she said. "Most people don't." She urged me to leave Black Hollow, and I didn't need much convincing. Within a week, I had transferred to a different college, far from the Appalachian foothills. Years have passed, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear faint whispers, like the echo of a chant carried on the wind. And every winter solstice, I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if the procession has found a new witness. When I moved into my late grandfather's house in the small, isolated town of Ravenswood, I thought it would be a fresh start. The town, surrounded by endless woods, felt like the perfect escape from the noise and chaos of city life. The house itself was old but sturdy, with an antique charm that reminded me of childhood summers spent visiting him. I was unpacking in the attic one rainy afternoon when I stumbled across an old leather-bound journal tucked inside a dusty wooden chest. The cover was faded, and the edges were frayed, but the initials JT, my grandfather's, were engraved on the front. I flipped through the pages out of curiosity. His handwriting was meticulous, though the entries were cryptic and unsettling. He wrote about the circle, the ritual, and the guardians of the dark flame. At first, I thought it was a work of fiction. My grandfather had been a history professor, and it wasn't hard to imagine him creating stories in his downtime. But then I found the map. The map was hand-drawn and detailed, showing a path from the house to a clearing deep in the woods. Beside the clearing was a crude drawing of a symbol, an intricate, looping design that looked vaguely like an eye encircled by flames. Below the symbol, in my grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "Beware the circle." Once entered, never escaped. Despite the warning, my curiosity got the better of me. The next day, armed with the map, a flashlight, and a sense of adventure, I set out to find the clearing. The woods were dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the forest itself is holding its breath. The further I went, the darker it seemed to grow, even though it was only mid-afternoon. The map guided me along a narrow, overgrown trail that twisted and turned until I finally arrived. The clearing was just as the map described, a circular patch of bare earth surrounded by tall, gnarled trees. In the center of the circle was the symbol from the map, carved into the ground with eerie precision. Around it were 6 stone pillars, each about 6 feet tall, their surfaces covered in strange runes. At first, I felt nothing but awe. The place had an ancient, almost sacred atmosphere, like stepping into another world. But then, I noticed something odd. The air within the circle was unnaturally still. No breeze, no chirping birds, not even the rustle of leaves. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped into the circle. The moment my foot touched the bare earth, a wave of nausea washed over me. The air seemed heavier, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. I tried to step back, but my legs felt rooted in place. Then I heard it, a low, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The symbol at the center of the circle began to glow faintly, a sickly green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. I spun around, looking for an explanation, but the clearing was empty. Or so I thought. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Then another, and another. Shapes emerged from the darkness, hooded figures dressed in tattered robes that seemed to blend into the forest. They formed a ring around the clearing, just beyond the circle's edge, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. Panic set in. I tried to call out, but my voice wouldn't work. The hooded figures began to chant, their voices a low, droning melody that made my skin crawl. The runes on the stone pillars started to glow, the same green light as the symbol on the ground. "Why are you here?" a voice boomed. It wasn't spoken aloud. It was in my head, echoing like thunder. I turned toward the source, but there was no one near me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Why do you disturb the circle?" I didn't mean to. I finally managed to shout. "I was just curious." The chanting grew louder, drowning out my words. The hooded figures raised their arms, and the light from the symbol flared, blindingly bright. When it dimmed, a new figure stood in the center of the circle. A tall, skeletal man draped in a cloak of shadow, his eyes glowing like burning coals. "You have trespassed," the figure said, its voice deep and otherworldly. "And now you are bound." "Bound to what?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "To the circle," it replied. "To the eternal watch." I didn't understand, but I didn't have time to ask. The skeletal figure raised a hand, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. Dark tendrils of smoke rose from the earth, wrapping around my ankles and pulling me downward. I screamed, struggling against the force, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the glowing eyes of the hooded figures, their chants echoing in my ears. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I noticed the mud on my shoes and the faint green glow coming from under my fingernails. Since that day, my life hasn't been the same. Every night, I dream of the circle. I see the hooded figures, hear their chants, feel the crushing weight of the air in the clearing. But it's not just in my dreams. Strange things happen when I'm awake. Shadows move where they shouldn't. Whispers follow me wherever I go. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see the glowing eyes of the skeletal figures staring back at me. I've tried to leave Ravenswood, but no matter how far I go, I end up back at the house, as if something is pulling me toward it. The journal is gone. I've searched every inch of the attic, but I can still feel its presence, like it's watching me. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The circle isn't just a place. It's a prison, a curse, a constant reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed. And now, as I write this, I hear the chanting again, faint but growing louder. The winter solstice is near, and the circle is calling. When I moved to the quiet coastal town of Blackmere, I thought I had found the perfect escape. Life in the city had drained me, and this quaint village, with its rocky shores and misty mornings, seemed like the ideal place to recharge. The locals were friendly, though reserved, and there was a curious charm about the place. It wasn't long before I noticed the peculiarities. Blackmere didn't have a church, a chapel, or any sign of organized religion. When I asked about it, the responses were vague. "We have our ways," or "We're a bit different here." At first, I dismissed it as harmless eccentricity. Then I found the symbol. It was carved into the base of a tree near the edge of the forest. Rough, looping design that resembled an inverted triangle encircled by jagged lines. Something about it unsettled me. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. When I mentioned it to the owner of the small cafe I frequented, her cheerful demeanor faltered. She quickly changed the subject, but not before muttering, "Best to leave that alone." Her reaction piqued my curiosity. I started noticing the symbol in other places, etched into the cornerstones of old buildings, painted on rocks along the shore, even subtly woven into the designs of shop signs. It was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. One evening, as I was walking home, I saw a group of people gathered near the forest. They stood in a circle, their faces obscured by the twilight. In the center of the circle, a fire blazed, casting eerie shadows that danced like living things. I hid behind a cluster of bushes and watched, my heart pounding. The group began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but the sound of it made my skin crawl. As the chant grew louder, the flames of the fire shifted, twisting upward into a column of dark smoke. Within the smoke, a shape began to form. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. I stumbled backward, my foot snapping a twig. The sound was deafening in the stillness. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the group turned as one to face me. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees gnarled and claw-like in the fading light. I could hear footsteps behind me, growing closer. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the safety of my small cottage, I locked the door and collapsed against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I peered out the window, but the forest was still, as if nothing had happened. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made me jump. When morning finally came, I convinced myself it had been a misunderstanding, a group of locals holding some harmless ritual, and my imagination had done the rest. But then the marks started appearing. At first, it was small scratches on my front door, arranged in the same looping symbol I had seen in the forest. Then I found it carved into the wooden beams of my porch, and finally, burned into the grass of my front yard. I confronted the cafe owner, desperate for answers. Her face turned pale, and she leaned in close, whispering, "You've been marked." "Marked for what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "For the shadow," she said, her eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "You've seen too much. They won't let you go now." I pressed her for more information, but she refused to say anything else, only urging me to leave Blackmere as soon as possible. I packed my bags that afternoon, but as I drove out of town, the fog grew impossibly thick. The road ahead seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't recognize, and after what felt like hours of driving, I found myself back at my cottage. It was as if the town itself wouldn't let me leave. That night, the chanting returned, louder and closer than before. The sound seemed to come from all directions, surrounding the house. Shadows moved outside my windows, and the symbol burned brighter in my yard, glowing with an unnatural light. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, clutching a kitchen knife, though I knew it would do no good. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the chanting rose to a deafening crescendo. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the bedroom was dark, save for a faint glow coming from the hallway. I crept toward the door and peeked out. The symbol had been burned into the floorboards, its light casting long, flickering shadows. In the center of the symbol stood the figure from the forest, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It raised a hand, impossibly long fingers curling toward me, and spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. "You belong to us now." The room spun, and I felt myself being pulled toward the figure, my body weightless and my mind filled with static. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I woke up the next morning on the floor of my bedroom, the house eerily quiet. The symbol was gone, and the marks outside had vanished. For a moment, I thought it was over, but it wasn't. I still see the figure in my dreams, always watching, always waiting. The chanting follows me wherever I go, a faint, inescapable hum at the edge of my hearing. And every so often, when I look in the mirror, I see the symbol etched faintly into my skin, glowing with that sickly light. I've tried to leave Blackmere, but the town won't let me go. It's as if I'm tethered to it, bound by some invisible chain. The locals avoid me now, their eyes filled with pity and fear. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The shadow is always watching, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me completely. If you ever find yourself in Blackmere, heed my warning. Don't look for the symbol. Don't ask about the rituals. And whatever you do, don't step into the woods. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some marks can never be erased. When my friend Nate invited me to his hometown for a weekend getaway, I didn't think twice. I'd heard about the quaint village of Hawthorne Hollow, a remote, picturesque place surrounded by endless fields and dense woods. It sounded like the perfect escape from city life, but Nate was hesitant when I brought up staying until Sunday night. "The Hollow's not the same after dark," he said, his tone half joking but with an edge of something more. "People here are different." I laughed it off. Different how? He shrugged and changed the subject. I should have pressed him harder. We arrived Saturday afternoon. The town looked like something out of a storybook, with cobblestone streets, ivy-covered cottages, and a clock tower that chimed every hour. But the atmosphere was strange. The few people we passed greeted Nate warmly, but shot me uneasy glances. Their smiles were polite, but didn't reach their eyes. That night, as we sat on Nate's porch, I heard something peculiar. A low, rhythmic drumming carried on the breeze. "What's that?" I asked. Nate's face darkened. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just local tradition." When I pressed him, he finally admitted, "It's the Elders' Accord. A sort of meeting, like a town hall?" "Not exactly." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's better if you don't ask questions." Curiosity got the better of me. After Nate went to bed, I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. The drumming grew louder as I walked, a deep, primal rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. The trail led me to the edge of the woods, where the trees stood like sentinels under the moonlight. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The forest was alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but the drumming overpowered everything. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I saw the light. Through the trees, a faint glow illuminated the darkness. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound. The clearing ahead was filled with people, at least 30 of them, dressed in long, dark robes. They stood in a circle around a massive stone altar, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the flickering torchlight. On the altar lay a young man, his wrists and ankles bound. He was alive but terrified, his eyes darting around as he struggled against his restraints. The drumming stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. One of the robed figures stepped forward, their face hidden beneath a hood. The figure began to chant, their voice low and guttural, the words incomprehensible. The others joined in, their voices blending into a haunting melody that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As the chant reached a crescendo, the symbols on the altar began to glow, pulsating with an otherworldly light. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the forest itself was holding me in place, forcing me to watch. Suddenly, the light from the symbols shot upward, forming a column that pierced the sky. Inside the light, a shadowy figure began to take shape, a towering inhuman form with eyes that burned like embers. The young man on the altar screamed, a sound that cut through the chanting like a knife. The robed figure raised their hands, and the shadowy entity reached out with elongated, claw-like fingers. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, branches clawing at my face and arms as I fled through the forest. The drumming resumed, faster and louder, chasing me like a heartbeat gone wild. When I finally burst out of the woods, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. Nate found me on the porch the next morning, pale and shaking. "You went to the woods, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and accusatory. I nodded, too scared to speak. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You've seen them now. They know. Who are they?" I managed to ask. "The Elders," Nate said. "They've been here since before the town was founded. The Accord is their way of maintaining balance. The sacrifice keeps them from taking more." I demanded we leave, but Nate shook his head. "You can't just leave. Not now. They won't let you." I didn't understand what he meant until later that evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the drumming started again. This time, it was closer. The sound filled the house, reverberating through the walls and floors. Shadows flickered at the edge of the room, moving in ways that defied logic. "They're coming for you," Nate said, his voice trembling. "You're the outsider, the one who broke the rules. What do I do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "There's nothing you can do," he said. "You're already marked." The door burst open, and the robed figures flooded inside, their faces still hidden. They surrounded me, their hands cold and unyielding as they dragged me from the house. Nate didn't move to stop them. He just stood there, his face a mask of guilt and fear. The forest was darker than before, the trees seeming to close in around us. The drumming grew louder, a deafening roar that vibrated in my chest. We reached the clearing, and I was thrown onto the altar. The symbols glowed once more, their light searing my skin. The chanting began, and the shadowy figure appeared again, its burning eyes locked onto mine. I don't remember much after that, just pain and cold and the feeling of being ripped apart from the inside. When I woke up, I was lying on the edge of the woods, my clothes torn and my body aching. The town was silent, the drumming gone. Nate's house was empty, his belongings gone as if he'd never existed. The townspeople avoided me, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. I left Blackmere that same day, but the mark of the elders follows me. Every night, I hear the drumming in my dreams, growing louder and closer. Shadows move where they shouldn't, and sometimes I catch glimpses of the glowing symbols on my skin. I don't know what they did to me that night, but I know it isn't over. The elders don't forget, and they don't forgive. If you ever find yourself in Hawthorne Hollow, heed my warning. Don't go into the woods. Don't follow the sound. And whatever you do, don't let them mark you. Once the elders have claimed you, there's no escape. When my Aunt Eliza passed away, she left me her house on Blackthorn Hill. It wasn't much, a 2-story, weather-beaten structure that had been in the family for generations. I'd only visited it once as a child, and my memories of that time were hazy. But with no immediate plans and a deep need for a change of scenery, I decided to move in and fix the place up. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. The house stood at the edge of a sprawling, shadowy forest, its windows staring like hollow eyes. The townspeople were polite but distant, and they seemed almost relieved when I mentioned staying out at Blackthorn Hill. "It's been empty for a reason," one elderly man muttered, refusing to elaborate when I pressed him. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning and repairing, and my evenings trying to relax with a book. But as the week went on, strange things began to happen. It started with the scratching. At first, I thought it was just tree branches against the house. But then I noticed the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, as if something, or someone, was deliberately scraping at the walls. One night, I followed the sound to the kitchen and found claw marks etched into the wooden door frame. They were deep and jagged, far too large to be from any animal I knew. I told myself it was probably nothing, a raccoon or stray dog, but deep down, I knew better. Then there were the voices. At first, they were faint, barely audible whispers that I convinced myself were just the wind. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, and I could swear they were speaking my name. One evening, I decided to explore the basement. I'd avoided it up until then. It was dark and damp, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me down there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs, but in the far corner, I found something that made my blood run cold. A circle was carved into the stone floor, surrounded by strange symbols I didn't recognize. In the center of the circle was a small, blackened altar, stained with what looked like dried blood. I spent the rest of the night poring over old books and online forums, trying to make sense of what I'd found. The symbols didn't match anything I could identify, but they had an ancient, menacing quality that made my skin crawl. That's when I stumbled upon an old article about Blackthorn Hill. According to local legend, the house had once belonged to a cult that practiced dark rituals in the basement. They believed the forest was home to a powerful entity, something they called the Keeper. The article claimed the cult had been disbanded decades ago, its members either arrested or mysteriously disappeared. But some believed their rituals had left a mark on the house and the land. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Around midnight, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the basement, my heart pounding. The symbols on the floor seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of iron. Then I saw it. A figure stood in the circle, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long and a face obscured by shadow. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when it spoke, its voice was like a chorus of whispers. "You have come," it said. I froze, unable to speak or move. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally fluid. "You must continue the work," it said, its voice filling the room. "The Keeper demands it." I don't remember how I got out of the basement. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the floor of the living room, trembling. The following days were a blur. I tried to leave Blackthorn Hill, but every time I got in my car, something went wrong. The engine wouldn't start, or the road would be blocked by fallen trees. It was as if the house wouldn't let me go. The whispers followed me everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. They spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of the keeper's hunger, and always they ended with the same chilling command: continue the work. Desperate for answers, I contacted a local historian who had written about the town's history. When I mentioned Blackthorn Hill, she fell silent. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said finally. "The house is cursed. The cult may be gone, but their influence remains." I told her about the figure in the basement, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "That's not a figure," she said. "That's the keeper's shadow. It's bound to the house, and it won't rest until the rituals are complete." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means you're trapped," she said. "The keeper has chosen you. I've tried everything to break free. I've burned sage, recited prayers, and even tried destroying the symbols in the basement. But nothing works. The house repairs itself, the symbols reappear, and the whispers grow louder. Last night, the figure appeared again, this time in my bedroom. It stood at the foot of my bed, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "The keeper grows impatient," it said. "You cannot resist. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The house is alive, and it wants me to continue the rituals. I've started seeing things, shadows that move on their own, faces in the mirrors, and figures in the forest. I've begun to wonder if leaving is even an option anymore. The house feels like it's become a part of me, or maybe I've become a part of it. If you ever find yourself near Blackthorn Hill, don't stop. Don't look at the house. Don't listen to the whispers, and above all, don't go inside. The keeper is always watching, and once it has you in its grasp, there's no escape." It started with an email. As a freelance journalist, I often receive tips from anonymous sources, but this one was different. The subject line read, "The Circle of Ashes, a Forgotten Truth." The body of the email contained only an address and a cryptic message. "If you want the story of a lifetime, come to Hollow Creek." Hollow Creek was a tiny, isolated town tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. There was little information about it online. No history, no population data, not even a mention on maps. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the town's single street. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and an eerie silence hung over the place. The address led me to a crumbling inn on the edge of town. Its wooden sign swung in the breeze, creaking ominously. The innkeeper, a wiry man with sunken eyes, handed me a key without a word. "The circle doesn't like outsiders," he muttered as I turned to leave. "What's the circle?" I asked. He looked at me like I just signed my own death warrant. "You'll find out soon enough." That night, I explored the town, hoping to find someone willing to talk. Most of the buildings were boarded up, and the few people I saw hurried inside as I approached. The only exception was a woman sitting on the steps of a church, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a candle. "They won't talk to you," she said as I drew closer. "But I will." Her name was Clara, and she told me the story of the Circle of Ashes. "It's not a myth," she began, her voice trembling. "It's real. The Circle is a cult, a group of people who believe they can control death itself. They perform rituals in the woods, offering sacrifices to something they call the Ashen One." I asked her why the townspeople tolerated it. "They don't have a choice," she said. "The Circle controls everything. If you cross them, you disappear." Clara gave me directions to the forest where the rituals supposedly took place. "Be careful," she warned. "If they catch you, you'll wish you'd never come here." Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I set out for the woods. The path was narrow and overgrown, and the air grew colder with each step. After about an hour, I found a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone circle, its surface blackened as if it had been scorched by fire. Surrounding it were symbols carved into the ground, spirals, triangles, and shapes I couldn't identify. I crouched behind a tree, my heart pounding. The clearing was empty, but the air felt charged, as if something unseen was watching. Suddenly, I heard voices. A group of people emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden by black hoods. They carried torches, their flames casting flickering light over the clearing. One of them stepped forward, holding a small, wriggling animal in their hands. A goat. The others began to chant, their voices low and guttural. The air grew thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood. The leader raised a knife, its blade glinting in the firelight, and brought it down in a swift, brutal motion. I turned away, my stomach churning. When I looked back, the air above the stone circle was shimmering, distorting like heat waves. A dark figure began to take shape, tall and featureless, with eyes that glowed like embers. The chanting grew louder, almost deafening, as the figure reached out a shadowy hand. The leader of the cult stepped forward, holding a bowl filled with the animal's blood. The figure dipped its hand into the bowl, and the blood began to sizzle and evaporate. The cultists fell silent, bowing their heads as the figure disappeared, leaving behind a trail of ash. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I stumbled back to the inn, my mind racing. Clara's story was true. The circle of ashes was real, and they were summoning something. The innkeeper was waiting for me when I returned. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he handed me a note. "You need to leave," he whispered. The note read, "We know you were there. Leave Hollow Creek or face the Ashen One." I packed my things and left immediately, but the road out of town was blocked by a fallen tree. I turned back, only to find the inn engulfed in flames. The townspeople stood in silence, their faces illuminated by the firelight, but none of them moved to stop it. Panic set in. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I was trapped. That night, I barricaded myself in the church. Clara was there, her face pale and her hands clutching a rosary. "They're coming for you," she said. "Why me?" I demanded. "Because you saw too much," she said. "The circle doesn't let outsiders live. Not after they've witnessed a ritual." Around midnight, the chanting began. It echoed through the town, growing louder and closer with each passing minute. Clara grabbed my arm. "We have to go." We fled through the back door of the church and into the woods. The chanting followed us, accompanied by the flickering light of torches. "They're summoning the Ashen One," Clara said. "If they find us before dawn, we're dead." The forest was a maze of shadows and sounds. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. The chanting grew louder, the voices blending into a haunting melody that seemed to seep into my very bones. Then I saw it. The Ashen One. It was taller than the trees, its form shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed like twin coals, and its elongated arms ended in claws that dripped with ash. It didn't walk. It glided, moving with an unnatural grace. Clara and I hid behind a fallen tree, our breaths shallow and silent. The Ashen One stopped, its head tilting as if sniffing the air. "We have to keep moving," Clara whispered. We ran until my legs felt like they would give out. Just when I thought we were safe, Clara stumbled and fell. Before I could help her, the cultists emerged from the shadows, their torches casting long, menacing shadows. They surrounded us, their chants rising to a fever pitch. The Ashen One appeared behind them, its form towering and terrible. One of the cultists stepped forward, pulling back their hood. It was the innkeeper. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said. The Ashen One reached out, its clawed hand descending toward us. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my car parked nearby. There was no sign of Clara or the cultists. Hollow Creek was gone, replaced by an overgrown field. My phone buzzed with messages and missed calls from friends and family, asking where I'd been for the past week. I tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed me. Now, every night, I dream of the Ashen One. It stands at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear the faint echo of chanting in the distance. The circle of ashes isn't gone. It never was. Growing up in a rural town in Maine, life was as uneventful as the gray skies that loomed over us most of the year. It wasn't until the summer of my 17th year that I learned the truth about my seemingly sleepy town. A truth I wish I could forget. It started with the disappearance of Emily Green. She was a year older than me and the closest thing to a best friend I had. One day, she just vanished. No note, no clues, nothing. The police called it a runaway case, but I knew better. Emily wouldn't leave without telling me. A week after she vanished, I found a strange note tucked into my locker at school. It was written in hurried, shaky handwriting. They took Emily. Beware the elder's mark. Meet me at the old mill at dusk. I had no idea who wrote it, but the mention of Emily was enough to draw me in. The old mill had been abandoned for decades, its skeletal remains sagging against the overgrown woods. By the time I got there, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the place in long shadows. A figure emerged from the shadows, Ethan, one of Emily's neighbors. He looked pale, his eyes darting around nervously. "You came," he said, his voice trembling. "Of course I came. What's going on? What's the elder's mark?" Ethan hesitated, then pulled up his sleeve. A strange symbol was burned into his forearm, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun drawn by a child. "They did this to me," he said. "The elder's mark. It's how they control you." "Who's they?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "The congregation," Ethan whispered. "Cult. They've been in this town for centuries. They're the reason Emily disappeared, and now they're after you." Ethan explained that the congregation worshipped something ancient, something they called the Elder. According to their beliefs, the Elder was a powerful being trapped between worlds, and it demanded sacrifices to maintain its favor. "They mark you first," Ethan said. "Once you have the Elder's mark, you belong to them. They can find you anywhere." I wanted to laugh it off, but the fear in Ethan's eyes was too real to ignore. "Why would they want me?" I asked. Ethan looked at me like I just asked the most naive question in the world. "Because you're strong. They want people like you for the rituals." That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against my window made me jump. The idea of a cult lurking in my town was ridiculous, but a small, nagging part of me couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was telling the truth. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I searched the library archives for anything about the congregation. Most of the town's history was mundane. Logging records, old photographs, but then I found an article from 1947. Mysterious disappearances linked to local society. The article described a series of disappearances, all young people, all with no explanation. The investigation led to a group of townspeople who called themselves the congregation, but no arrests were ever made. That evening, I found another note in my house. It was on my pillow, even though I'd locked every door and window. "Stop asking questions. The Elder sees all." The fear was suffocating, but I couldn't back down. If Emily was alive, I had to find her. Ethan and I decided to follow a lead he'd uncovered, a farm on the outskirts of town that he believed was the congregation's gathering place. We waited until nightfall and then crept through the woods. The farm was eerily quiet, its windows dark. We slipped into the barn, where a trapdoor led to an underground chamber. The air was damp and smelled of decay. The chamber was lined with shelves filled with ancient books and jars of strange substances. In the center was an altar, stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Ethan froze, his face pale. "We need to go," he whispered. But before we could move, we heard voices. We hid behind a stack of crates as a group of people entered the chamber, dressed in dark robes. One of them carried a struggling figure, Emily. I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. She looked pale, her wrists bound and her mouth gagged. The robed figures began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. One of them stepped forward, holding a dagger. Ethan grabbed my arm. "We can't stop them," he whispered. "We'll die if we try." But I couldn't just stand there. Before I could think, I grabbed a heavy jar from the shelf and hurled it at the nearest figure. It shattered, and the room erupted into chaos. Ethan and I fought our way to Emily, untying her and dragging her toward the exit. The cultists shouted, their voices mixing with the guttural chant that seemed to echo from the very walls. Just as we reached the trapdoor, a deafening roar filled the chamber. I turned and saw something emerging from the shadows, a massive, writhing form that defied logic. It was as if the darkness itself had come to life, with glowing eyes that burned like fire. The elder, Ethan, whispered, his voice filled with terror. We scrambled out of the barn and ran into the woods, the sound of the cultists and the elder close behind. The trees seemed to close in around us, the air growing colder with every step. Finally, we burst into a clearing, the lights of the town visible in the distance. But as we approached, we saw figures standing in the road. More cultists, their faces hidden behind masks. There was no escape. The cultists surrounded us, their chants growing louder. The elder loomed behind them, its monstrous form barely contained by the shadows. Ethan stepped forward, raising his hands. "Take me," he said. "Just let them go." The cultists paused, as if considering his offer. Then one of them stepped forward and marked his forehead with a symbol drawn in ash. Ethan turned to me, tears streaming down his face. "Run." I didn't want to leave him, but I had no choice. I grabbed Emily's hand, and we ran toward the town. Behind us, the chanting reached a fever pitch, and the air was filled with an ear-splitting roar. By the time we reached safety, the woods were silent. Ethan was never seen again. Emily and I tried to explain what happened, but no one believed us. The official story was that Ethan had run away, just like Emily supposedly had. But I knew the truth. Every night, I dream of the elder, its glowing eyes burning into my soul. And every morning, I wake up with the feeling that it's still watching me. The congregation is still out there, still marking its chosen, still feeding the elder. And I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me. The small town of Ashgrove was a strange place. Nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by dense woods, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Growing up, I thought the isolation was charming, but now I know the truth. Isolation can hide horrors. It all started with the bell tower. Perched on a hill overlooking the town, the bell tower was old, much older than the rest of Ashgrove. No one knew who built it or why it stood there, and the town records didn't mention its construction. The bell hadn't rung in decades, but on quiet nights, people claimed they could hear a low hum coming from it, like the tower was alive. My best friend, Chris, was obsessed with the tower. He had a knack for finding creepy stories, and he loved to scare me with tales of its dark past. There's a reason they don't let anyone up there. He told me one summer night as we sat around a campfire. It's cursed. They say the last person who climbed to the top disappeared. Disappeared? I scoffed. How convenient. Who told you that? Chris grinned. Old Mrs. Harrow. She said her brother went up there as a kid, and they never found him. I laughed it off, but deep down, the story stuck with me. That fall, strange things started happening. Animals began disappearing. Pets, livestock, even birds seemed to avoid the area. At night, people reported seeing flickering lights near the bell tower. Chris was convinced it was the work of a cult. Think about it, he said one afternoon as we biked past the hill. What if they're using the bell tower for rituals? Maybe that's why the town keeps it locked up. I rolled my eyes, but part of me couldn't help but wonder. The breaking point came on Halloween night. Chris and I decided to climb the hill and see the bell tower up close. We weren't planning to break in, just to take a look. Or at least, that's what I thought. The night was chilly, the moon casting long shadows as we made our way up the hill. The closer we got to the tower, the more uneasy I felt. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on us. When we reached the base of the tower, Chris pulled out a set of lockpicks. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "We're going in," he said, grinning. Before I could stop him, he had the door open. The inside of the tower was worse than I imagined. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Chris's flashlight illuminated a spiral staircase leading up to the bell. "Come on," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't leave him alone. Reluctantly, I followed. The staircase creaked under our weight, each step echoing through the hollow tower. As we climbed, the air grew colder, and I started to hear faint whispers. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Chris nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, It's coming from above. When we reached the top, the whispers stopped. The bell hung in the center of the room, massive and covered in rust. But what caught my attention was the floor beneath it. A circle was drawn in chalk, surrounded by candles, all burned down to stubs. In the center of the circle was a book, its pages open and covered in strange writing. "This is it," Chris whispered. "Proof of the cult." Before I could stop him, he stepped into the circle. The moment his foot crossed the line, the air around us seemed to shift. The whispers returned, louder this time, and the candles flickered to life, their flames burning an unnatural blue. "Chris, get out of there," I shouted, but he was frozen, staring at the book. His eyes glazed over, and he began to speak in a voice that wasn't his own. "They are bound by the pact," he intoned. "The bell tolls for the chosen." The room shook, and the bell let out a deep, resonant chime. I grabbed Chris and pulled him out of the circle. The moment we broke contact, the room went silent. The candles extinguished, and the air returned to its heavy stillness. Chris collapsed to the floor, his breathing shallow. When he came to, he couldn't remember what had happened. "We need to go," I said, helping him to his feet. But as we turned to leave, the whispers started again, louder and more insistent. We ran down the stairs, the whispers following us like a swarm of angry bees. When we burst out of the tower, the door slammed shut behind us. The lights in the windows of Ashgrove were comforting as we stumbled down the hill. But as we reached the edge of the woods, I realized something was wrong. The town was too quiet. When we reached the main street, it was empty. The houses were dark, their doors wide open. It was as if everyone had vanished. "Where is everyone?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the bell tolled again, its sound echoing through the deserted streets. We ran to my house, hoping to find my parents, but it was empty too. On the kitchen table was a note written in the same strange symbols we'd seen in the tower. Chris picked it up, his hands shaking. "What does it say?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he dropped the note and backed away, his face pale. "They're gone," he whispered. "They've taken everyone." That night, we barricaded ourselves in the house, too afraid to sleep. The bell tolled at regular intervals, its deep chime shaking the walls. At dawn, the sound stopped, and the town was silent once more. We ventured outside, hoping to find someone, anyone. But Ashgrove was empty. Cars were still parked in driveways, and meals sat uneaten on tables. But the people were gone. Chris and I were the only ones left. We tried to leave town, but every road led us back to the bell tower. It was as if the valley itself was keeping us trapped. Desperate, we decided to return to the tower. If the answers were anywhere, they were there. The tower was unchanged, but the book in the circle was gone. In its place was a single line of text, written in blood. "The pact is fulfilled." "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice breaking. Chris shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we're next." To this day, I don't know what happened to the people of Ashgrove. Chris and I survived for weeks, scavenging food from empty houses and avoiding the bell tower. But eventually, Chris disappeared too. Now, I'm the only one left, and the bell still tolls. Every time it rings, I feel its pull, like a thread winding tighter around my soul. I know it's only a matter of time before the bell claims me too. And when it does, I'll finally understand the pact that bound my town to its sinister fate. When I first moved to the sleepy town of Willowhaven, I thought I had found the perfect escape. The city had worn me down, with its relentless pace and the constant noise of a life that never stopped. Willowhaven was quiet, peaceful, and wrapped in the kind of charm that seemed untouched by time. But there was something off about the town, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with the way people looked at me. At first, I chalked it up to being new in a small community where everyone knew each other. But the stares lingered too long, and the smiles felt forced. I dismissed it as small-town oddness until I noticed the curfews. Every night, without fail, the streets emptied by 9 p.m., shops closed early, and houses locked up tight. When I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Crane, about it, she gave me a tight smile and said, "It's just how things are here." Best to stay inside after dark. I should have listened. The first time I saw the procession, I had been in Willowhaven for 2 weeks. It was a Friday night, and I was restless. I'd been unpacking all day and wanted some fresh air, so I decided to take a walk. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Even the crickets and frogs seemed to know better than to make a sound. I was about to turn back when I saw them. A line of people, dressed in black robes, walking silently down the main street. They carried candles, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. I ducked behind a parked car, my heart racing. Something about the procession felt wrong. The way they moved, in perfect unison, as if guided by an unseen force. The way their faces were blank, like masks, and the way the air seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that made my teeth ache. At the front of the procession was a figure holding a staff. The top of it was adorned with a carved crescent moon, and they wore a headdress that obscured their face. As they passed, I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest sound would give me away. I followed them. I know it was a stupid thing to do, but curiosity got the better of me. Keeping a safe distance, I trailed them through the streets and out of town. They were heading toward the woods, their path illuminated only by the glow of their candles. The deeper we went, the darker it became. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy of trees, and I had to rely on the faint light of the procession to guide me. Eventually, they stopped in a clearing. The clearing was dominated by a massive stone altar, weathered and covered in strange symbols. Surrounding it were carved wooden totems, their faces grotesque and twisted. The procession formed a circle around the altar, and the figure with the staff stepped forward. I hid behind a tree, my heart pounding as I watched. The figure raised the staff, and the humming in the air grew louder. It was no longer just a vibration. I could hear it now, a low chant in a language I didn't recognize. Then, from the shadows, they brought her forward. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, and her hands were bound. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around the clearing as if searching for an escape. The figure with the staff gestured toward the altar, and 2 robed individuals forced her onto it. I wanted to do something, to stop them, but fear rooted me in place. The chanting grew louder, the totems seeming to twist and writhe in the flickering candlelight. The air was electric, charged with a palpable sense of dread. The figure began to speak, their voice deep and resonant. They spoke of an ancient pact, a deal made long ago to protect the town. They called upon someone, to accept the offering and renew the bond. As the words filled the clearing, the air grew cold. A mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around the altar. And then, it appeared. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, a shadow given form. It had no face, just a void where its features should be, and its body seemed to shift and ripple, like smoke trapped in a glass jar. The woman on the altar screamed. The figure with the staff raised it high, and the shadow descended. It enveloped the woman, her screams cutting off abruptly as the mist consumed her. When it retreated, she was gone. The clearing fell silent. The robed figures began to chant again, this time in a tone of reverence. The shadow lingered for a moment before dissolving into the air, leaving nothing behind but a chilling emptiness. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet or careful. I just needed to get away. Branches scratched my face, and roots snagged my feet, but I didn't stop until I was back in my house. I locked the doors and windows, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, the town was as it always was, quiet, friendly, normal. People smiled and waved, their eyes betraying nothing of the horrors I had witnessed. But I noticed something strange. There were no missing posters, no police, no one asking questions about the woman from the night before. It was as if she had never existed. I tried to leave Willowhaven, but every road out of town seemed to loop back. It didn't matter which direction I went or how far I drove. I always ended up back at the town square. The townsfolk started to notice my unease. Mrs. Crane brought over a pie one evening, her smile too wide. "You'll settle in soon enough," she said. "We all do." The next procession came a week later. This time, I didn't follow them. I stayed locked in my house, the blinds drawn and the doors barricaded, but I could hear them, the chanting carrying on the wind, the hum in the air shaking the walls of my home. The next morning, another face was missing from the town, and no one said a word. I've been in Willowhaven for 3 months now. I've stopped trying to leave. The roads are endless, and every attempt only brings me back here. I've started to notice things I didn't before, the way the townsfolk avoid the woods, the way they exchange glances when someone new arrives, and the way they never seem to grow old. Last night, I heard the chanting again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the woods, it was coming from outside my house. I looked out the window and saw them, the robed figures, standing in my yard. At the front was the figure with the staff, the crescent moon glinting in the moonlight. They raised their hand and pointed at me. I don't know how much time I have left. The air feels heavier today, and the shadows seem to move when I'm not looking. I can hear the hum again, growing louder with each passing hour. Tonight, the procession will come for me, and I'll finally understand what it means to be part of the pact. The first time I heard about the Forgotten, I thought it was just another urban legend. Small towns like Gray Hollow thrived on these stories, passing them down through generations like heirlooms. But unlike most, this story wasn't told with a smirk or a laugh. People whispered about the Forgotten in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously, as if the mere mention of the name could summon something terrible. I never believed in any of it until I found the mark. It started when I moved into my aunt's old house after her passing. Aunt Meredith was always the black sheep of the family, living alone on the outskirts of town in a house that seemed to lean with age. The property was surrounded by woods so dense that the sunlight barely broke through, even on the brightest days. She left the house to me in her will, and though my parents begged me to sell it, I decided to stay for a while. I needed a fresh start, and Gray Hollow felt like the perfect place to disappear. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time cleaning and unpacking, trying to make the old house feel like home. But on the third night, I noticed something strange. There was a symbol carved into the wooden floor of the living room, right beneath the faded rug my aunt had kept there. It was intricate, with sharp angles and spirals that seemed to twist endlessly inward. At first, I thought it was just some kind of folk art, but the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Doyle, the elderly woman who lived next door, her face went pale. "Cover it back up," she said, gripping my arm with surprising strength for someone her age. "Don't speak of it to anyone, and whatever you do, don't touch it." I should have listened to her. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stop thinking about the symbol, so I went back to the living room and uncovered it. I traced the grooves with my fingers, wondering what it meant. As I did, a chill ran down my spine, and the air seemed to grow heavier. I heard it then, a low whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was coming from inside the house. It wasn't words, just a soft, rhythmic murmur, like a chant. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went into town to ask about the symbol. Most people refused to talk to me, their faces tightening at the mention of it. The only person who gave me any answers was an old man named Emery, who ran the town's dusty bookstore. "That's the mark of the Forgotten," he said, his voice low. "It's older than this town, older than the forest itself. It's a calling card, a way to summon them." "Summon who?" I asked, but Emery just shook his head. "Don't dig any deeper, son. Some things are better left buried." But I couldn't let it go. That evening, I went back to the living room and examined the mark again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint red stain around the edges, as if someone had spilled wine or paint. But when I touched it, it felt sticky, like fresh blood. I jumped back, my heart pounding. That's when I saw the shadows. They were flickering at the edge of my vision, just beyond the reach of the dim light in the room. Every time I turned to look, they were gone, but I could feel them watching me. By the time night fell, I was a nervous wreck. I decided to sleep with the lights on, hoping that would keep whatever was out there at bay. But around midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and I was left with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then came the whispers. They were louder now, circling around me, growing more insistent. I scrambled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam flickered and died. That's when I saw the first figure. It was standing in the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. Its body was cloaked in shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. As I stared, more of them appeared, their forms shifting and writhing as if they weren't entirely solid. They didn't move closer. They just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen in terror and them waiting, but eventually, I worked up the courage to speak. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. One of them stepped forward, and though it didn't have a mouth, I heard its voice clear as day. "The pact." The next morning, I went back to Emery. I told him everything, and he sighed heavily, as if he'd been expecting this. "A long time ago," he said, "this town was in trouble. Crops were failing, people were starving, and the forest seemed to close in around us more each day. That's when they came, the Forgotten. They offered us a deal, prosperity in exchange for a sacrifice." I stared at him in disbelief. "A sacrifice? You mean people?" Emery nodded. "Every few years, someone has to bear the mark. They're taken, and the town thrives. Your aunt was the last one, but now that she's gone," he didn't have to finish the sentence. I understood. The mark was on me now. I didn't go back to the house that night. Instead, I drove as far as I could, hoping to outrun whatever was coming for me. But no matter how far I went, I always ended up back in Gray Hollow. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I parked my car outside the house and reluctantly went inside. The mark was glowing now, pulsing with a faint, eerie light. That's when I heard the knock at the door. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening pounding that shook the walls. The whispers came back, filling the air, and the shadows began to creep closer. I backed into the living room, my eyes fixed on the mark. The whispers were deafening now, and the room felt like it was closing in on me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the mark's glow intensified. Then, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, they were there, the Forgotten. They surrounded me, their forms shifting and pulsing like living darkness. The one with the glowing eyes stepped forward and extended a hand. "The pact must be honored," it said. I don't know why I took its hand. Maybe I thought it would end the nightmare. Maybe I thought I could bargain with them. But the moment our hands touched, I felt a cold so deep it seemed to freeze my soul. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the woods. The mark on the floor of the living room was gone, but I could still feel it, burned into my chest like a brand. The Forgotten were nowhere to be seen, but I knew they were watching. I tried to leave Gray Hollow again, but this time, the forest wouldn't let me. Every road twisted back into town, and every path led to the clearing where the Forgotten had taken me. Now, I'm just waiting. The townsfolk avoid me, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. They know what's coming, but they won't say it out loud. I've stopped asking questions, stopped trying to understand. The mark glows brighter each night, and the whispers grow louder. I know it won't be long now. The Forgotten will return, and this time, there will be no escape. Growing up, my family never talked about my Uncle Henry. His name was mentioned only in whispers, and always with a nervous glance over the shoulder. When I turned 18, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked my dad what had happened to him. He hesitated for a long time before finally saying, "Henry got mixed up in something he shouldn't have. Something dark. That's all you need to know." But I needed to know more. It wasn't until a decade later, after my father passed, that I found a dusty box tucked away in the attic. It was filled with old photos, letters, and a journal, Henry's journal. As I flipped through its brittle pages, I realized this was more than a keepsake. It was a confession. Henry had been part of something called the Church of the Eternal Flame. At first, it seemed like any other small-town religious group, but the deeper he got involved, the darker it became. The journal entries grew more frantic as he described the rituals, the strange symbols, and the whispers of a fire that could consume not just flesh, but souls. I should have left it alone. I should have burned the journal and pretended I never saw it. But instead, I went looking for answers. The journal mentioned a town called Ashwood, a tiny, almost forgotten place deep in the mountains. I found it on an old map and decided to visit. The drive was long and eerie, the road winding through dense forests that seemed to swallow the sunlight. When I finally arrived, Ashwood felt like a ghost town. The streets were empty, the houses worn and abandoned. But at the center of it all stood a massive stone church, its spire piercing the gray sky like a jagged blade. This was it, the Church of the Eternal Flame. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of ash and something metallic, like blood. The walls were lined with carvings of flames, each one more intricate and menacing than the last. At the far end of the church, where an altar would normally stand, there was a massive fire pit. Though it was empty, I could feel its heat, as if the embers were still smoldering just beneath the surface. I wasn't alone. "Can I help you?" The voice made me jump. I turned to see an elderly man standing in the shadows. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken but sharp. He wore a black robe trimmed with red, and around his neck hung a pendant in the shape of a flame. I'm just looking around," I stammered. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a sacred place. Only the faithful may enter." "I'm looking for answers," I said, summoning what little courage I had. "About my uncle, Henry. He was part of this group." The man's expression darkened. Henry was weak. He didn't understand the gift we offered him. "But perhaps you will." I should have left right then and there, but something about his words and the way he said them made me stay. He introduced himself as Father Elias and offered to tell me about the church. I followed him deeper into the building, down a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever. At the bottom was a cavernous room lit by dozens of torches. The walls were covered in symbols, and in the center was another fire pit, this one filled with a glowing, otherworldly flame that danced and writhed as if alive. "This," Elias said, his voice reverent, "is the eternal flame. It is not just fire. It is a doorway, a connection to the divine. Through it, we are purified, transformed." The flame seemed to call to me, its light casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. As I stared, I felt a pull, as if it were drawing me in. I backed away, shaking my head. "This is insane," I said. "It's just fire." Elias chuckled. "That's what Henry said too. But he learned the truth in the end." "What truth?" "That the flame is a test. It chooses who is worthy. Those who embrace it are reborn. Those who reject it," he trailed off, his smile widening. "Well, let's just say they don't leave." I left that night, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was all some elaborate trick, a way to manipulate desperate people. But deep down, I knew there was something real about that flame, something terrible. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it, but the dreams wouldn't let me. Every night, I dreamed of the flame, its light growing brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. I could hear voices in the fire, whispering my name, urging me to return. And so, I did. When I went back to the church, Father Elias was waiting for me, as if he'd known I would come. This time, there were others with him, men and women in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. They formed a circle around the fire pit, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Elias gestured for me to step forward. "The flame has called you," he said. "Will you answer?" My legs felt like lead as I approached the pit. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, but I couldn't look away. The flame seemed to grow taller, its colors shifting from orange to blue to black. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. Elias's smile vanished. "There is no, the flame has chosen you. To refuse is to condemn yourself." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Then, before I could change my mind, I stepped into the fire. At first, there was pain, blinding, searing pain that tore through my body. But then it was gone, replaced by a strange, numbing cold. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the church anymore. I was standing in a vast, empty void, surrounded by endless darkness. The only light came from the flame, which floated before me, its shape shifting and pulsing like a living thing. "You have come," a voice said, deep and resonant. It wasn't Elias or any of the others. It was the flame itself. The flame spoke of power, of knowledge beyond anything I could imagine. It promised me strength, immortality, and freedom from fear. All I had to do was surrender, give myself to it completely, but as it spoke, I saw something in the darkness. Shadows moved at the edge of the void, their forms twisted and grotesque. They were the others who had stepped into the flame, their souls trapped and devoured. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I won't." The flame roared, its light flaring angrily. The shadows surged toward me, their hands clawing at the air. I ran. I don't know how I escaped, but when I came to, I was lying outside the church, the morning sun breaking through the trees. The doors were gone, and the building was crumbling, as if it had been abandoned for years. I left Ashwood that day and never looked back, but the flame hasn't forgotten me. I still see it in my dreams, its whispers growing louder with each passing night, and I know one day it will come for me. When I was 17, my best friend Marcus disappeared. He was the kind of guy who lit up a room, always smiling, always cracking jokes. We grew up together in a small, quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. So, when he vanished, it wasn't just a shock. It was like the whole town held its breath. The police found his car abandoned at the edge of Ravenwood Forest, a sprawling expanse of dense trees and twisted trails that no one in town dared to venture into after dark. The official story was that Marcus had run away, but I didn't buy it. He would have told me if he were planning to leave. A week after his disappearance, I found a note in my locker. It was written in Marcus's handwriting, but the message was cryptic. "Find the Scarlet Circle. The truth is in the woods." I couldn't ignore it. The idea of Marcus being in trouble, out there somewhere, gnawed at me. So, one Friday night, armed with a flashlight and more courage than sense, I went into Ravenwood Forest. The air was thick and still, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The deeper I went, the darker it became, the trees blotting out the moonlight. I followed a narrow trail that seemed more like an animal path, the ground uneven and littered with roots that threatened to trip me at every step. Then I saw it, a faint, red glow in the distance. The glow led me to a clearing where a group of people stood in a circle around a massive, ancient oak tree. They wore crimson robes, their faces obscured by hoods. In the center of the circle was an altar made of stone, etched with strange, swirling symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. I hid behind a tree, my heart pounding as I watched them. They were chanting in a language I didn't recognize, their voices low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. On the altar lay a small wooden box, bound with thick, black cords. Suddenly, one of the robed figures stepped forward and opened the box. Inside was a dagger, its blade curved and gleaming as though it had just been polished. The chanting grew louder as the leader raised the dagger high, its edge catching the red glow. I didn't realize I'd stepped closer until I snapped a twig underfoot. The sound was deafening in the silence, and every hooded head turned in my direction. "Who's there?" the leader demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Panic surged through me. I turned to run but tripped over a root and hit the ground hard. Before I could get up, they were on me. Hands grabbed my arms and dragged me into the clearing. The hooded figures loomed over me, their faces hidden in shadow. "What are you doing here?" the leader demanded again, his voice cold. I'm looking for my friend," I stammered. "Marcus." At the mention of his name, a murmur rippled through the group. The leader tilted his head, as if considering my words. Then he gestured to the others, and they dragged me to the altar. "You shouldn't have come," the leader said, his tone almost regretful. "But perhaps it's fate. The Scarlet Circle doesn't take kindly to intruders, but maybe you'll prove useful." "What are you talking about?" I asked, struggling against the hands that held me. He ignored my question and nodded to one of the others. A woman stepped forward, her hood falling back to reveal a pale face and piercing green eyes. She held a small vial filled with a thick, crimson liquid. "Drink," she said, holding it out to me. "No way," I said, shaking my head. The leader's expression hardened. drink, or face the consequences. I didn't have a choice. With trembling hands, I took the vial and swallowed its contents. It tasted metallic, like blood, and burned as it went down. Almost immediately, my vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to shift and twist. When my vision cleared, I wasn't in the clearing anymore. I was standing in a vast, red-lit cavern, the walls shimmering as though made of liquid fire. The robed figures were there, their forms shadowy and indistinct. The altar was now a massive stone slab, and above it hovered a swirling, blood-red vortex. "This is the truth you sought," the leader said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "The Scarlet Circle is not a cult. We are the guardians of the veil, the barrier between this world and the next." "What does that have to do with Marcus?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The leader stepped aside, and I saw him, Marcus. He was chained to the altar, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with terror. "He was chosen," the leader said, "a sacrifice to strengthen the veil. Without it, the darkness beyond would consume us all." "No," I shouted, lunging toward the altar. But the robed figures held me back, their grip like iron. "You don't understand," the leader said. "This is necessary. The veil is weakening. If we do not act, the things beyond will break through. There has to be another way." I pleaded. The leader hesitated, then looked at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "There is a new sacrifice, one willing to take his place." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at Marcus, his eyes silently begging me to save him. I knew what I had to do. "I'll do it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The leader studied me for a long moment before nodding. "So be it." They unchained Marcus and led him away. Then they turned to me, binding my wrists and guiding me to the altar. The vortex above it seemed to pulse in anticipation, its light growing brighter. As I lay on the cold stone, the leader raised the dagger high. The chanting resumed, the words vibrating in the air around me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of pain, there was a sudden, deafening roar. The vortex exploded in a blinding flash of light, and I felt myself falling, tumbling into endless darkness. When I woke, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning sun filtering through the trees. The clearing was empty, the altar gone. There was no sign of the robed figures or Marcus. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But then I saw the mark on my wrist, a small, flame-like scar that pulsed faintly with an unnatural warmth. I never saw Marcus again, and I never went back to Ravenwood Forest. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the chanting in my dreams, and I know, deep down, that the Scarlet Circle isn't done with me yet. It was a dreary Tuesday afternoon when I first learned about the Hollow Assembly. I was a freshman at the local university, still adjusting to the strange rhythm of college life. Most days felt like a blur of assignments, class lectures, and late-night study sessions. But there was always a few hours of daylight when the campus seemed to transform into a quiet oasis. I was on my way to the library when I saw them for the first time. At the edge of campus, hidden behind a line of tall trees, was an old, crumbling chapel. I had passed it countless times, but today, something felt different. The chapel had always been a part of the university's history, a relic from decades ago, but I had never seen anyone enter or leave. It was as though it had been forgotten by time. But today, there were people gathered in front of it. They weren't students, at least not the ones I recognized. They were older, dressed in dark, tattered robes, their faces obscured by hoods. They seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. As I walked by, I overheard snatches of conversation, whispers that didn't make sense, words that felt foreign. Something about the turning and the time has come. The way they spoke sent a chill down my spine. It didn't feel right. Later that evening, I tried to push it from my mind. College life was stressful enough without getting caught up in strange events. But when I received an invitation the next day, my curiosity overruled my hesitation. The invitation was simple, just an old, yellowed piece of paper with a single sentence written in ink. "Join us at the Hollow Chapel. The assembly awaits you." At first, I thought it was a prank. But then I remembered the people from the day before. They couldn't have known who I was, yet here I was, being summoned. The temptation to see what was happening at that chapel gnawed at me. So, I decided to go. That night, as I made my way to the chapel, I could hear the distant murmur of voices rising from the trees. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and every instinct in my body screamed to turn back. But something deeper pushed me forward, something I couldn't explain. When I arrived, the chapel looked even more ancient than I remembered. The door creaked open as I approached, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was dimly lit by flickering candlelight. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of incense and something darker, something metallic. The group of hooded figures stood in a circle at the altar, their chants filling the air. I couldn't make out their words, but the tone was unmistakable, an ancient rhythm, both hypnotic and unnerving. One of the figures turned toward me, a pale face barely visible under the hood. He raised a hand, signaling for me to come closer. Without thinking, I stepped forward. "You've come," the man said. His voice was smooth, almost coaxing. "We've been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" I repeated, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The man smiled, though his eyes seemed to gleam with something far darker. "You have been chosen." A shiver ran down my spine, but before I could ask what he meant, the circle shifted. They parted to make way for me. The leader, who I now realized was not just any member, but someone who held authority, gestured for me to stand at the center. A low, eerie hum rose from the group, and I could feel the weight of their gaze on me. "What is this?" I demanded, suddenly panicked. "What do you want from me?" The leader tilted his head, and I saw a gleam in his eyes. "What we want is simple. You will join us in the Hollow Assembly. The ritual of the turning begins now. It is your destiny." I tried to back away, but a pair of hands gripped my arms, holding me firmly in place. The air grew thick, like something heavy was pressing against my chest. "Let go of me," I screamed, struggling against their grip. The leader raised his hand, and the others fell silent. "You can't escape. The Hollow Assembly has already marked you." One of the figures approached me with an ornate knife. It gleamed under the candlelight, and for a moment, I thought my heart would stop. "No, no, please," I gasped, my voice strangled by fear. The leader's eyes softened, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Do not fear the turning. It is a blessing. It is the end of your old self and the beginning of your true purpose." Before I could react, the person with the knife gently pried my fingers open, placing the cold blade against my palm. A sharp, searing pain shot through me as they drew a symbol, something twisted and intricate, across my skin. The blood welled up, hot and thick, running down my hand and dripping onto the floor. The leader murmured something in a language that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air seemed to vibrate with energy, and then the entire room went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, I was lying in the center of the chapel, alone. The room was silent, and the candles had all burned out. My hand was still throbbing with pain, the mark on my palm now a jagged scar. The strange symbol from before was still visible, burned into my skin. I tried to stand, but I felt weak, dizzy, as though I had been drained of something vital. The room spun around me, and I stumbled to my feet, my breath shallow. As I looked around, I realized something terrible. The chapel was no longer just an abandoned building. It had changed. The walls were covered with strange symbols, symbols that weren't there before. The altar was now adorned with artifacts I didn't recognize, old relics, bones, and books bound in materials I couldn't name. The air was thick with a sense of finality, a lingering presence that filled every corner of the room. I wasn't alone anymore. The sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness, and I spun around, heart racing. Standing at the doorway was one of the hooded figures from before, but now there was something different about them. Their face, once hidden, was exposed, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Their eyes were completely black, the whites of their eyes replaced with an endless void. The figure smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of something ancient, something hungry, "You are one of us now," they whispered. "The turning is complete." I ran. I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to escape, but the desire to get out of that place, away from those people, overwhelmed everything else. The chapel seemed to stretch endlessly, the door just out of reach, no matter how much I ran. The shadows closed in around me, whispers rising in the dark. The same chant from before filled the air, now faster, more frantic. I turned one last time to see the figure standing in the center, watching me with those empty eyes. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed. "The hollow assembly has already claimed you." I don't know how I made it out of there, but when I stumbled into the campus the next morning, the sun felt alien, too bright, too real. I thought I had left it all behind. The strange ritual, the blood, the chant, but the mark on my hand still burned. And every night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. They are calling my name, pulling me back into the hollow assembly. One thing I learned too late: once you're chosen, you can never truly leave. I had always been skeptical about ghost stories, conspiracy theories, and anything that veered into the realm of the supernatural. My friends used to tease me for being the only one in our group who dismissed creepy tales about haunted places or secret societies. But that was before I encountered the Forsaken Circle. Now, I can't get those nights out of my mind, and I wish I could forget everything that happened, but I can't. It all started when my friend Ethan invited me to visit his family's cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It seemed like the perfect chance to unwind and escape the stress of school. The cabin was secluded, located deep in the forest and far from civilization. As soon as I arrived, Ethan told me something that caught my attention. "There's a spot nearby, deep in the woods. You've probably heard about it if you've been around here for a while." "What spot?" I asked, curious. "It's an old clearing. Locals call it the Circle. Some people say it's haunted. They think some weird rituals were performed there years ago." Of course, being the skeptic that I was, I laughed it off. "Haunted? Yeah, right. Who in their right mind would still believe in stuff like that?" Ethan shrugged, clearly not expecting me to take him seriously. But later that night, as we sat by the fire, something strange happened. One of the older members of his family, a cousin named Alex, who was just a little too quiet for my taste, leaned over to me and whispered, "Don't go near the Circle, ever." It wasn't the warning that bothered me. It was the look in his eyes, something close to fear. I laughed it off, of course, but a part of me started to wonder, was there something more to this old clearing than just spooky stories? The next day, Ethan and I decided to take a hike into the woods. We packed a small bag with water and snacks, and I jokingly mentioned how we should keep our eyes peeled for ghosts. The further we ventured, the eerier the woods became. The trees seemed to grow taller, their gnarled branches twisting into strange shapes that looked almost unnatural. There was an oppressive silence hanging in the air, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. It didn't take long before we stumbled across the clearing. It was everything I had imagined, and more. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a wide, open area surrounded by thick trees, their branches forming a sort of natural wall. But the moment I stepped into the clearing, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The temperature had dropped, and the air was unnervingly still. No birds, no insects, no sounds of nature, just an eerie silence. In the center of the clearing was an arrangement of large stones, arranged in a perfect circle. It looked ancient, weathered, moss-covered, and worn down by time. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something odd. The stones were arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Ethan," I whispered, "do you think this is the circle Alex warned us about?" Ethan nodded, his face pale. "I think so. And honestly, I don't want to stick around to find out what's been done here." I agreed. The air felt heavy, like something dark had settled here long ago. But just as we turned to leave, something stopped me. I had noticed something strange etched into one of the stones, a symbol that seemed both familiar and foreign. It was an intricate design, almost like a mixture of runes and shapes I couldn't quite identify. "Wait," I said, stepping closer to get a better look. But as I reached out to touch the stone, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, knocking me back. I stumbled, feeling disoriented. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of chanting, low and muffled. It sounded like a distant echo, but it was coming from all around us. Ethan's eyes widened in fear. "Did you hear that?" Before I could respond, the ground beneath us seemed to shift, and the stones around the circle started to glow faintly. At first, it was barely noticeable, but as the chanting grew louder, the glow intensified. It was as if the stones were alive, reacting to something we couldn't see. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. "We need to go. Now." We turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the forest floor as we made our way back toward the cabin. The sounds of chanting continued to follow us, but when we reached the edge of the woods, the noise stopped. The silence returned, and the coldness faded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind. Had I really heard chanting? Had the stones glowed? It felt like I had stepped into a nightmare, and yet, it had been all too real. Ethan seemed just as uneasy. At dinner, he didn't speak much, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark windows. But as the night wore on, his unease turned into something else, guilt. "I should have told you more about the circle before we went," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, looking around to make sure no one was listening. Then, he spoke in a low voice. "The circle isn't just a place for old rituals. It's something darker. My family, the ones who've lived here for generations, they've always warned against it. But there's one thing no one talks about. My great-grandfather. He was part of the original group that founded the Hollow Assembly." I stared at him, stunned. "What? You're telling me your great-grandfather was involved in a cult?" Ethan nodded, his face pale. "Yes, and when the assembly first came to the area, they used the circle for their rituals. They believed it was a place where they could call upon forces beyond our world. But things went wrong. They opened a doorway they couldn't control. Some of the members disappeared. Others were never the same." I felt my stomach churn. "Are you saying that whatever's still there, whatever's left, is still active? That it's still waiting for someone to—" Ethan cut me off. "It's not just waiting. It's feeding. The rituals, the chanting. It never really stopped. My family has kept it hidden, but there are still people in the woods. They call themselves the Forsaken Circle now. They continue what my great-grandfather started. And once you're marked by the circle, there's no escaping." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept hearing faint rustling noises outside, as if something was moving in the woods. And the worst part was, I knew something was waiting for us at the clearing. The next morning, I went to the clearing alone. Ethan had begged me not to go back, but I couldn't shake the need to understand what was happening. When I arrived, the stones were no longer glowing. In fact, they looked exactly like they did the first time I had seen them, but the air felt wrong. It was thick and oppressive, as though the land itself was holding its breath. I knelt by the stones, staring at the strange symbol. This time, I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the stone, everything around me went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke, I was lying in the middle of the circle. The chanting was louder now, and the cold was unbearable. My body felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on me from all sides. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. My arms and legs wouldn't move. And then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was dressed in the same dark robes as the others, their face hidden beneath a hood. But I could feel their gaze, their eyes boring into me, empty and full of malice. "You're too late," the voice whispered. "The Forsaken Circle has already claimed you." And with that, the chanting grew louder. I felt a searing pain in my chest, like something was being ripped out of me. I don't know how I escaped. All I remember is running until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. I never went back to the woods. I couldn't, but the nightmares didn't stop. The faces of the Forsaken Circle haunt me, and the sound of their chanting echoes in my mind. It's as though the circle never truly left. I can still feel it calling to me, waiting for me to return. It was the summer of 2004 when I first heard about the blood moon ritual. At the time, I was just an ordinary high school senior, living in a small, sleepy town that rarely saw any excitement. But everything changed the night I stumbled upon a secret that had been buried for decades. It all began when I started spending more time with my new friend, Alex. We had met at a party a few weeks earlier and quickly became close. Alex was a bit of an outsider, the kind of person who was always a little too curious about things that were better left alone. He had this mysterious air about him that both fascinated and disturbed me. He was constantly talking about strange events, hidden secrets, and things that no one else seemed to care about. One evening, as we sat at a park bench under the stars, Alex told me about an old legend he had uncovered. "You've heard of the blood moon, right?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yeah, of course," I replied. "It's that rare lunar event where the moon turns red, right?" Alex nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "It's not just some cool astronomical event. It's a signal for something much darker. For centuries, people have been waiting for the blood moon to come, to complete a ritual that's been passed down through secret societies and hidden cults." I raised an eyebrow. "A ritual? What kind of ritual?" Alex leaned in closer, lowering his voice even further. "A ritual that can open a door to another world. A world full of power, darkness, and things beyond human comprehension. But only those who are chosen can perform the ritual. And when they do, they are granted unimaginable power." I wasn't sure what to make of it. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. Still, I couldn't help but feel intrigued. "So, are you saying there are people in this town who are part of this cult?" Alex nodded. "Yes, they've been here for generations. They've been waiting for the blood moon to return, and it's coming soon." As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about Alex. His stories started to get darker, more disturbing. He would talk about strange symbols carved into trees, ancient books that were hidden in the woods, and rituals that involved blood sacrifices. I tried to brush it off as just a phase, but the more he talked, the more I felt drawn into his world. Then, one evening, Alex invited me to a secluded cabin in the woods. "You have to see this place," he said. "It's where everything started." Against my better judgment, I agreed to go. I figured it would be an adventure, just a weekend trip to get away from the town and have some fun. But when I arrived at the cabin, I immediately felt uneasy. The cabin was old and weathered, its wooden walls creaking with every gust of wind. There was an aura of decay about the place, as though it had been abandoned for years, yet somehow remained intact. Alex led me inside. The interior was dimly lit, filled with bookshelves crammed with old, dusty volumes. Strange symbols were scrawled on the walls in what looked like charcoal. The air was thick with the smell of incense, and there was a faint, almost metallic taste in the air. It made my stomach churn. "Look at this," Alex said, holding up an ancient book with a leather cover. He opened it to a page filled with unfamiliar symbols, drawings of twisted creatures, and cryptic passages written in a language I couldn't even begin to recognize. "That's the ritual," Alex explained. "It's been passed down for generations. My family has been preparing for this for centuries. And now, with the blood moon so close, we're ready." I stared at the pages in shock. My heart was pounding in my chest as I began to realize the gravity of what Alex was saying. This wasn't just some weird game or joke. He was serious. And worse, I was in over my head. "Alex," I said, my voice shaking, "what exactly are you planning to do? What's going to happen during the blood moon?" Alex's face twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something far more sinister. "We're going to open the door. We're going to summon the things that are waiting on the other side. And when we do, we will have power beyond anything we could ever imagine." The night of the blood moon arrived sooner than I expected. I should have run away, should have told someone what was happening, but I didn't. I stayed. Something inside me, something dark and curious, kept me rooted to the spot. And deep down, I think I knew there was no escaping once the ritual had begun. Alex and I, along with a few others from his family, drove out to a secluded field just outside of town. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie, red glow over the landscape. The air was thick with anticipation. I could hear the rustling of leaves in the trees, but there was no wind. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. We gathered in a circle, the group standing around a strange altar made of stone. The stones were covered in symbols, some familiar, some I had never seen before. The others in the group were silent, their eyes fixed on the moon as they began to chant in a low, guttural language. It sounded like the very earth itself was whispering, and I could feel the ground beneath me tremble. Alex stepped forward, holding a small, ornate knife. He raised it above his head, his face illuminated by the blood-red moon. "Tonight," he said, his voice shaking with excitement, "we open the gate. Tonight, we become more than human." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. The air around me felt heavy, thick with the power that was building. I could see the others in the circle closing their eyes, their faces contorted in concentration. They were all lost in the ritual, as if they were no longer aware of the world around them. Alex plunged the knife into the ground, and the earth trembled violently. The chanting grew louder, more frantic. The red light from the moon seemed to intensify, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. No, someone, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by a hooded cloak. The air around it seemed to warp, bending and twisting as if reality itself was being distorted. I could feel its presence, its power, its hunger, and I knew, in that moment, that we had made a terrible mistake. The creature stepped forward, its eyes glowing like embers. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice in my mind, a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down my spine. "You have summoned me," it said, its voice vibrating through my bones. "And now, I will take what is mine." I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. The ritual had gone horribly wrong. This wasn't about power. This wasn't about some grand, ancient mystery. It was a mistake, an invitation to something ancient and evil. The others in the circle stood frozen, as if they had no control over their bodies anymore. It was as if they were no longer human, but puppets in the hands of something far older, far darker. Alex's eyes locked with mine, and for the first time, I saw true fear in them. "We've unleashed it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's too late to stop it now." The creature reached out, its long fingers brushing the air like tendrils of smoke. The ground beneath us cracked open, revealing an abyss of blackness. And in that moment, I knew that whatever had been waiting for this night, for the blood moon, was not of this world. I don't remember what happened next. Everything became a blur, a swirl of images, sounds, and sensations. The last thing I recall was being dragged away by something, my limbs numb, my body cold as I was pulled into the darkness. I woke up hours later, alone in the field. The moon was no longer red. The air was still. The earth was silent. The others were gone. The cabin where I had met Alex was abandoned, left untouched as if no one had ever lived there. I never found out what happened to him or the others. Some say they disappeared, leaving no trace. Others say they are still out there, wandering, forever marked by the ritual they performed. But I know the truth. Whatever was summoned that night, it didn't leave. It still watches, waiting for the next blood moon to return. And now, I can never forget the creature's eyes, glowing red like the moon. Waiting, watching, hungry. I can feel it calling to me. And I know, deep down, that it will never stop. It was late fall when I first came across the strange little town of Thistlewood. I was driving back home after a long solo road trip, trying to clear my head. The place looked like something out of a postcard. Quaint houses, cobbled streets, and trees with golden leaves scattered across the ground. It felt peaceful at first, almost too perfect. But it wasn't long before I realized that Thistlewood was hiding something far darker beneath its idyllic surface. I had just pulled off the main highway when I saw the town sign. It was small and unassuming, almost as if it were trying to hide its existence. Thistlewood, it read, the letters old and chipped. There was no mention of the population or any welcoming phrase like, "Welcome to Thistlewood, home of friendly faces." It simply stood there, silent and foreboding. I decided to stop for the night, figuring I could use some rest before continuing on my journey. I found a small and that seemed to be the only place for lodging. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Wren, greeted me with a forced smile, almost like she was trying to hide something. But I chalked it up to the fact that it was a small town and strangers probably weren't common. That night, I stayed in a room that felt like it had been stuck in time. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture was old, and there was a musty smell in the air. I wasn't sure if it was the century-old decor or the town itself, but something about the place felt off. I decided to take a walk around the town after dinner to clear my head. As I walked down the street, I noticed that most of the houses had their lights off. The town felt eerily empty, as if everyone had disappeared for the evening. I passed by a small chapel on the edge of town. It had tall, dark windows, and the door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a peek inside. The inside of the chapel was even more unsettling than its exterior. The pews were lined up neatly, but the air inside was heavy and cold. There was no cross or religious iconography anywhere. Instead, the walls were adorned with strange symbols, almost like runes, and there was a large altar at the far end of the room, covered in what looked like dust. The whole place had a stagnant, forgotten feel to it, as if it hadn't been used in decades. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, startled, but saw no one. My heart raced, and I quickly turned back to the altar, only to find that something had changed. A strange, dark figure was standing in front of it, a man in a long black cloak with a hood covering his face. His presence sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. He didn't speak, but the air felt thick with an unsettling energy, as if something ancient and malevolent was in the room with me. Before I could react, the man raised his hand in a slow, deliberate motion, and I felt my body seize up. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the figure, who now seemed to be growing in size, becoming more and more menacing. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. I was released from the strange paralysis, and I stumbled backward, gasping for air. The man was gone. The chapel was silent. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't know whether it was my imagination or something much darker at play, but I wasn't about to stay and find out. I ran out of the chapel and back into the streets. I could hear faint murmurs from the houses around me, like whispers carried by the wind. The town, once so still, now felt alive with something sinister lurking in the shadows. I made my way back to the inn, my heart pounding in my chest. I was eager to leave the next morning, but something told me that wasn't going to be as simple as it sounded. As I entered the lobby, I noticed Mrs. Wren standing behind the counter, watching me intently. There was something in her eyes, something calculating, something knowing. "Did you enjoy your walk?" she asked, her voice soft, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. I did, but I think it's time for me to leave," I stammered, trying to sound confident despite the unease creeping up my spine. Mrs. Wren smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was thin, almost like a warning. "Oh, I'm afraid you can't leave just yet," she said. "You see, the town doesn't let people leave once they've been here." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "I'm just passing through," I replied, my voice shaky. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced out the window, her expression becoming distant, almost as if she was lost in thought. Then she turned back to me, her gaze more intense than ever. "It's tradition," she said. "Once you come to Thistlewood, you become part of it. The town is a part of you, and it will never let you go." I backed away slowly, fear mounting in my chest. "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Wren stepped forward, her movements deliberate. "You've already seen the chapel, haven't you? Seen the altar? The congregation?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost like a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She continued, her tone now almost mournful. "The people of Thistlewood have been part of a special tradition for many generations. We are the silent congregation. We worship in silence, without words, without names. The ritual we perform binds us to the town, to the land. It makes us one with it. But those who stumble upon our town, like you, are meant to join the congregation. We can't allow you to leave, for if you do, the town will. It will take something from you. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My heart hammered in my chest, and my palms grew clammy. No, I can't stay here, I gasped. I need to go. Please let me leave. Mrs. Wren's smile faded, and her eyes darkened. You'll learn soon enough, she said softly. The blood moon will rise again, and the congregation will gather for the final ritual. You're already a part of it. There's no going back. Before I could respond, the door to the inn swung open, and a few more figures in dark robes entered. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and judging. One of them, a tall woman with long, thin fingers, stepped forward. It's time, she said, her voice smooth but firm. I didn't understand what was happening, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. I bolted for the door, ignoring the calls behind me, but the moment I stepped outside, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread. The town was different now. The streets were lined with dark figures, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Their eyes glowed faintly, as though they had been waiting for me. I ran through the streets, my breath ragged, my heart thumping in my chest. But no matter where I turned, the figures followed, always just a step behind. I could feel their eyes boring into me, and the whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. Join us, join us. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, the town seemed to close in on me. The streets stretched out endlessly, looping back on themselves, like the very land was warping, trapping me inside. The moon above me grew blood red, casting an eerie light over everything. The congregation had gathered in the center of town, their silent figures standing in perfect formation, waiting. I knew then that I was trapped. There was no escape from Thistlewood, no way out. I had become part of their ritual, a permanent part of the silent congregation. And no matter how hard I tried to resist, I knew I would never leave. The last thing I remember was the cold touch of a hand on my shoulder and the whisper in my ear, "Welcome to the congregation." And then, everything went black. To this day, I don't know if I'm still in Thistlewood, if I'm still running, or if I've truly joined this silent congregation. But I can feel them around me, always watching, always waiting. If you ever find yourself on a long, lonely road and come across a town that seems too perfect, too quiet, don't stop. For once you do, Thistlewood will claim you, just like it claimed me, and you will never leave.